The Bad Child's Book of Beasts by Hilaire Belloc. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Child, do not throw this book about. Refrain from the unholy pleasure of cutting all the pictures out. Preserve it as your chiefest treasure. Child, have you never heard it said that you are heir to all the ages? Why, then, your hands were never made to tear these beautiful, thick pages. Your little hands were made to take the better things and leave the worse ones. They also may be used to shake the massive paws of elder persons. And when your prayers complete the day, darling, your little tiny hands were also made, I think, to pray for men that lose their fairylands. Dedication to Master Evelyn Bell of Oxford. Evelyn Bell, I love you well. Introduction. I call you bad, my little child, upon the title page, because a manner rude and wild is common at your age. The moral of this priceless work, if rightly understood, will make you from a little Turk unnaturally good. Do not as evil children do, who on the slightest grounds will imitate the kangaroo with wild, unmeaning bounds. Do not as children badly bred, who eat like little hogs, and when they have to go to bed will whine like puppy dogs, who take their manners from the ape, their habits from the bear, indulge the loud, unseemly jape, and never brush their hair. But so control your actions that your friends may all repeat, this child is dainty as the cat, and as the owl, discreet. The Yak. As a friend to the children, commend me the yak. You will find it exactly the thing it will carry and fetch. You can ride on its back, or lead it about with a string. The Tartar who dwells on the plains of Tibet, a desolate region of snow, has for centuries made it a nursery pet, and surely the Tartar should know. Then tell your papa where the yak can be got, and if he is awfully rich, he will buy you the creature, or else he will not. I cannot be positive which. The Polar Bear. The polar bear is unaware of cold that cuts me through, for why, he has a coat of hair. I wish I had one too. The Lion. The lion, he dwells in the waste. He has a big head and a very small waist, but his shoulders are stark and his jaws they are grim, and a good little child will not play with him. The Tiger. The tiger, on the other hand, is kittenish and mild. He makes a pretty playfellow for any little child, and mothers of large families who claim to common sense will find a tiger well repay the trouble and expense. The Dromedary. The dromedary is a cheerful bird. I cannot say the same about the curd. The Whale. The whale that wanders round the pole is not a table fish. You cannot bake or boil him whole, nor serve him in a dish. But you may cut his blubber up and melt it down for oil, and so replace the causal bean, a product of the soil. These facts should be all noted down and ruminated on by every boy in Oxford town who wants to be a Don. The Camel, the ship of the desert. The Hippopotamus. I shoot the hippopotamus with bullets made of platinum, because if I use leaden ones, his hide is sure to flatten them. The Dodo. The dodo used to walk around and take the sun and air. The sun yet warms his native ground. The dodo is not there. The voice which used to squawk and squeak is now forever dumb. Yet you may see his bones and beak all in the museum. The Marmoset. The species man and marmoset are intimately linked. The marmoset survives as yet, but men are all extinct. The Camelopard. The camelopard, it is said by travelers who never lie, he cannot stretch out straight in bed because he is so high. The clouds surround his lofty head, his hornlets touch the sky. How shall I hunt this quadruped? I cannot tell, not I. I'll buy a little parachute, a common parachute with wings. I'll fill it full of arrowroot and other necessary things, and I will slay this fearful brute with stones and sticks and guns and slings. The learned fish. This learned fish has not sufficient brains to go into the water when it rains. The elephant. When people call this beast to mind, they marvel more and more at such a little tail behind, so large a trunk before. The big baboon. The big baboon is found upon the plains of Cariboo. He goes about with nothing on, a shocking thing to do. But if he dressed respectably and let his whiskers grow, how like this big baboon would be to Mr. So-and-so. The rhinoceros. Rhinoceros, your hide looks all undone. You do not take my fancy in the least. You have a horn where other brutes have none. Rhinoceros, you are an ugly beast. The frog. Be kind and tender to the frog, and do not call him names, as Slimy Skin, or Pollywog, or likewise Ugly James, or Gappa Grin, or Toad Gone Wrong, or Billy Bandy Knees. The frog is justly sensitive to epithets like these. No animal will more repay a treatment kind and fair, at least so lonely people say who keep a frog, and by the way, they are extremely rare. End of The Bad Child's Book of Beasts by Hilaire Belloc. Read by David Wales.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
Belling the Cat by Aesop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The mice once called a meeting to decide a plan to free themselves of their enemy, the cat. At least they wished to find some way of knowing when she was coming, so they might have time to run away. Indeed, something had to be done, for they lived in such constant fear of her claws that they hardly dared stir from their dens by night or day. Many plans were discussed, but none of them was thought good enough. At last, a very young mouse got up and said,
"I have a plan that seems very simple, but I know it will be successful. All we have to do is to hang a bell about the cat's neck. When we hear the bell ringing, we will know immediately that our enemy is coming."
All the mice were much surprised that they had not thought of such a plan before. But in the midst of the rejoicing over their good fortune, an old mouse arose and said, "I will have to say that the plan of the young mouse is very good. But let me ask one question. Who will bell the cat?" It is one thing to say that something should be done, but quite a different matter to do it. Belling the Cat by Aesop.
The Cat-hood of Maurice by E. Nesbit. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. To have your hair cut is not painful, nor does it hurt to have your whiskers trimmed. But round wooden shoes shaped like bowls are not comfortable wear, however much it may amuse the onlookers to see you try to walk in them. If you have a nice fur coat like a company promoter's, it is most annoying to be made to swim in it. And if you had a tail, surely it would be solely your own affair. That any one should tie a tin can to it would strike you as an unwarrantable impertinence, to say the least. Yet it is difficult for an outsider to see these things from the point of view of both the persons concerned. To Maurice, scissors in hand, alive and earnest to snip, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to shorten the stiff whiskers of Lord Hugh Cecil by a generous inch. He did not understand how useful those whiskers were to Lord Hugh, both in sport and in the more serious business of getting a living. Also it amused Maurice to throw Lord Hugh into ponds, though Lord Hugh only once permitted this liberty. To put walnuts on Lord Hugh's feet, and then to watch him walk on ice, was, in Maurice's opinion, as good as a play. Lord Hugh was a very favourite cat, but Maurice was discreet, and Lord Hugh, except under violent suffering, was at that time anyhow dumb. But the empty sardine tin attached to Lord Hugh's tail and hind legs, this had a voice, and rattling against stairs, banisters, and the legs of stricken furniture, it cried aloud for vengeance. Lord Hugh, suffering violently, added his voice, and this time the family heard. There was a chase, a chorus of "Poor pussy and pussy," then, and the tail and the tin and Lord Hugh were caught under Jane's bed. The tail and the tin acquiesced in their rescue. Lord Hugh did not. He fought, scratched, and bit. Jane carried the scars of that rescue for many a long week. When all was calm, Maurice was sought, and after some little natural delay, found in the boot-cupboard. "Oh, Maurice," his mother almost sobbed, "how can you? What will your father say?" Maurice thought he knew what his father would do. "Don't you know," the mother went on, "how wrong it is to be cruel?" "I didn't mean to be cruel," Maurice said, and what is more, he spoke the truth. All the unwelcome attentions he had showered on Lord Hugh had not been exactly intended to hurt that stout veteran. Only it was interesting to see what a cat would do if you threw it in the water, or cut its whiskers, or tied things to its tail. "Oh, but you must have meant to be cruel," said Mother, "and you will have to be punished." "I wish I hadn't," said Maurice, from the heart. "So do I," said his mother with a sigh, "but it isn't the first time. You know you tied Lord Hugh up in a bag with the hedgehog only last Tuesday week. You'd better go to your room and think it over. I shall have to tell your father directly he comes home." Maurice went to his room and thought it over, and the more he thought, the more he hated Lord Hugh. Why couldn't the beastly cat have held his tongue and sat still? That, at the time, would have been a disappointment, but now Maurice wished it had happened. He sat on the edge of his bed and savagely kicked the edge of the green Kidderminster carpet, and hated the cat. He hadn't meant to be cruel. He was sure he hadn't. He wouldn't have pinched the cat's feet, or squeezed its tail in the door, or pulled its whiskers, or poured hot water on it. He felt himself ill-used, and knew that he would feel still more so after the inevitable interview with his father. But that interview did not take the immediately painful form expected by Maurice. His father did not say, "Now I will show you what it feels like to be hurt." Maurice had braced himself for that, and was looking beyond it to the calm of forgiveness which should follow the storm, in which he should so unwillingly take part. No, his father was already calm and reasonable, with a dreadful calm, a terrifying reason. "Look here, my boy," he said, "this cruelty to dumb animals must be checked, severely checked." "I didn't mean to be cruel," said Maurice. "Evil," said Mr. Basingstoke, for such was Maurice's surname, "is wrought by want of thought as well as want of heart. What about your putting the hen in the oven?" "You know," said Maurice, pale but determined, "you know I only wanted to help her to get her eggs hatched quickly. It says in Fowls for Food and Fancy that heat hatches eggs." "But she hadn't any eggs," said Mr. Basingstoke. "But she soon would have," urged Maurice. "I thought a stitch in time—" "That," said his father, "is the sort of thing that you must learn not to think." "I'll try," said Maurice, miserably hoping for the best. "I intend that you shall," said Mr. Basingstoke. "This afternoon you go to Dr. Strong-the-Arm's for the remaining week of term. If I find any more cruelty taking place during the holidays, you will go there permanently. You can go and get ready." "Oh, father, please not," was all Maurice found to say. "I'm sorry, my boy," said his father much more kindly. "It's all for your own good, and it's as painful to me as it is to you, remember that. The cab will be here at 4. Go and put your things together, and Jane shall pack for you." So the box was packed. Mabel, Maurice's kiddy sister, cried over everything as it was put in. It was a very wet day. "If it had been any school but old Strong's," she sobbed. She and her brother knew that school well. Its windows, dulled with wire blinds, its big alarm bell, the high walls of its grounds bristling with spikes, the iron gates always locked, through which gloomy boys imprisoned scowled on a free world. Dr. Strong-the-Arm's was a school for backward and difficult boys. Need I say more? Well, there was no help for it. The box was packed, the cab was at the door, the farewells had been said. Maurice determined that he wouldn't cry, and he didn't, which gave him the one touch of pride and joy that such a scene could yield. Then at the last moment, just as father had one leg in the cab, the taxis called. Father went back into the house to write a cheque. Mother and Mabel had retired in tears. Maurice used the reprieve to go back after his postage-stamp album. Already he was planning how to impress the other boys at old Strong's, and his was really a very fair collection. He ran up into the schoolroom, expecting to find it empty, but someone was there, Lord Hugh, in the very middle of the ink-stained tablecloth. "You brute," said Maurice. "You know jolly well I'm going away, or you wouldn't be here." And indeed the room had never, somehow, been a favourite of Lord Hugh's. "Meow," said Lord Hugh. "Mew," said Maurice with scorn. "That's what you always say. All that fuss about a jolly little sardine tin. Any one would have thought you'd be only too glad to have it to play with. I wonder how you'd like being a boy. Lickings and lessons and impots and sent back from breakfast to wash your ears. You wash yours anywhere. I wonder what they'd say to me if I washed my ears on the drawing-room hearthrug." "Meow," said Lord Hugh, and washed an ear, as though he were showing off. "Mew," said Maurice again. "That's all you can say." "Oh, no, it isn't," said Lord Hugh, and stopped his ear-washing. "I say," said Maurice in awestruck tones. "If you think cats have such a jolly time," said Lord Hugh, "why not be a cat?" "I would if I could," said Maurice, "and fight you." "Thank you," said Lord Hugh, "but I can't," said Maurice. "Oh, yes, you can," said Lord Hugh. "You've only got to say the word." "What word?" Lord Hugh told him the word, but I will not tell you, for fear you should say it by accident, and then be sorry. "And if I say that, I shall turn into a cat?" "Of course," said the cat. "Oh, yes, I see," said Maurice. "But I'm not taking any thanks. I don't want to be a cat for always." "You needn't," said Lord Hugh. "You've only got to get some one to say to you, 'Please leave off being a cat and be Maurice again,' and there you are." Maurice thought of Dr. Strong-i-the-Arms. He also thought of the horror of his father when he should find Maurice gone, vanished, not to be traced. "He'll be sorry then," Maurice told himself, and to the cat he said suddenly, "Right, I'll do it. What's the word again?" Said the cat. Said Maurice, and suddenly the table shot up to the height of a house, the walls to the height of tenement buildings. The pattern on the carpet became enormous, and Maurice found himself on all fours. He tried to stand up on his feet, but his shoulders were oddly heavy. He could only rear himself upright for a moment, and then fell heavily on his hands. He looked down at them. They seemed to have grown shorter and fatter, and were encased in black fur gloves. He felt a desire to walk on all fours, tried it, did it. It was very odd. The movement of the arms straight from the shoulder, more like the movement of the piston of an engine than anything Maurice could think of at that moment. "I am asleep," said Maurice. "I am dreaming this. I am dreaming I am a cat. I hope I dreamed that about the sardine tin, and Lord Hugh's tail, and Dr. Strong's." "You didn't," said a voice he knew, and yet didn't know. "And you aren't dreaming this." "Yes, I am," said Maurice, "and now I'm going to dream that I fight that beastly black cat, and give him the best licking he ever had in his life. Come on, Lord Hugh." A loud laugh answered him. "Excuse my smiling," said the voice he knew and didn't know, "but don't you see you are Lord Hugh?" A great hand picked Maurice up from the floor and held him in the air. He felt the position to be not only undignified but unsafe, and gave himself a shake of mingled relief and resentment when the hand set him down on the inky tablecloth. "You are Lord Hugh now, my dear Maurice," said the voice, and a huge face came quite close to his. It was his own face, as it would have seemed through a magnifying glass, and the voice, oh horror, the voice was his own voice, Maurice Basingstoke's voice. Maurice shrank from the voice, and he would have liked to claw the face, but he had had no practice. "You are Lord Hugh," the voice repeated, "and I am Maurice. I like being Maurice. I'm so large and strong. I could drown you in the water, but my poor cat, oh, so easily. No, don't spit and swear. It's bad manners, even in a cat." "Maurice!" shouted Mr. Basingstoke from between the door and the cab. Maurice, from habit, leapt towards the door. "It's no use your going," said the thing that looked like a giant reflection of Maurice. "It's me he wants." "But I didn't agree to your being me." "That's poetry, even if it isn't grammar," said the thing that looked like Maurice. "Why, my good cat, don't you see that if you are I must be you? Otherwise we should interfere with time and space, upset the balance of power, and as likely as not destroy the solar system. Oh yes, I'm you, right enough, and shall be, till someone tells you to change from Lord Hugh into Maurice. And now you've got to find someone to do it." "Maurice!" thundered the voice of Mr. Basingstoke. "That'll be easy enough," said Maurice. "Think so?" said the other. "But I shan't try yet. I want to have some fun first. I shall catch heaps of mice." "Think so?" "You forget that your whiskers are cut off. Maurice cut them. Without whiskers, how can you judge of the width of the places you go through? Take care you don't get stuck in a hole that you can't get out of, or go in through, my good cat." "Don't call me a cat," said Maurice, and felt that his tail was growing thick and angry. "You are a cat, you know, and that little bit of temper that I see in your tail reminds me." Maurice felt himself gripped round the middle, abruptly lifted, and carried swiftly through the air. The quickness of the movement made him giddy. The light went so quickly past him that it might as well have been darkness. He saw nothing, felt nothing, except a sort of long sea-sickness, and then suddenly he was not being moved. He could see now. He could feel. He was being held tight in a sort of vice, a vice covered with checkered cloth. It looked like the pattern, very much exaggerated, of his school knickerbockers. It was. He was being held between the hard, relentless knees of that creature that had once been Lord Hugh, and to whose tail he had tied a sardine tin. Now he was Lord Hugh, and something was being tied to his tail, something mysterious, terrible. Very well, he would show that he was not afraid of anything that could be attached to tails. The string rubbed his fur the wrong way. It was that annoyed him, not the string itself. And as for what was at the end of the string, what could that matter to any sensible cat? Maurice was quite decided that he was, and would keep on being, a sensible cat. The string, however, and the uncomfortable tight position between those checkered knees, something or other was getting on his nerves. "Maurice!" shouted his father below. The string, however, and the uncomfortable tight position between those checkered knees, something or other was getting on his nerves. "Maurice!" shouted his father below, and the becatted Maurice bounded between the knees of the creature that wore his clothes and his looks. "Coming, father!" this thing called, and sped away, leaving Maurice on the servant's bed, under which Lord Hugh had taken refuge with his tin can, so short and yet so long a time ago. The stairs re-echoed to the loud boots, which Maurice had never before thought loud. He had often, indeed, wondered that any one could object to them. He wondered now no longer. He heard the front door slam. That thing had gone to Dr. Strong-o'-the-Arms. That was one comfort. Lord Hugh was a boy now. He would know what it was to be a boy. He, Maurice, was a cat, and he meant to taste fully all catty pleasures from milk to mice. Meanwhile he was without mice or milk, and unaccustomed as he was to a tail, he could not but feel that all was not right with his own. There was a feeling of weight, a feeling of discomfort, of positive terror. If he should move, what would that thing that was tied to his tail do? Rattle, of course. Oh, but he could not bear it if that thing rattled. Nonsense, it was only a sardine tin. Yes, Maurice knew that, but all the same, if it did rattle. He moved his tail the least little soft inch, no sound. Perhaps really there wasn't anything tied to his tail, but he couldn't be sure unless he moved. But if he moved, the thing would rattle, and if it rattled, Maurice felt sure that he would expire or go mad. A mad cat! What a dreadful thing to be! Yet he couldn't sit on that bed for ever, waiting for the dreadful thing to happen. Oh dear, sighed Maurice the cat. I never knew what people meant by afraid before. His cat heart was beating heavily against his furry side. His limbs were getting cramped. He must move. He did. And instantly the awful thing happened. The sardine tin touched the iron of the bed-foot. It rattled. Oh, I can't bear it! I can't! Cried poor Maurice, in a heart-rending meow that echoed through the house. He leapt from the bed and tore through the door and down the stairs, and behind him came the most terrible thing in the world. People might call it a sardine tin, but he knew better. It was the soul of all the fear that ever had been or ever could be. It rattled. Maurice, who was a cat, flew down the stairs. Down, down, the rattling horror followed. Oh, horrible! Down, down, at the foot of the stairs, the horror caught by something, a banister, a stair rod, stopped. The string on Maurice's tail tightened. His tail was jerked. He was stopped. But the noise had stopped too. Maurice lay only just alive at the foot of the stairs. It was Mabel who untied the string and soothed his terrors with strokings and tender love words. Maurice was surprised to find what a nice little girl his sister really was. I'll never tease you again, he tried to say softly, but that was not what he said. What he said was, purr. Dear pussy, nice poor pussy then, said Mabel, and she hid away the sardine tin and did not tell anyone. This seemed unjust to Maurice, until he remembered that, of course, Mabel thought that he was really Lord Hugh, and that the person who had tied the tin to his tail was her brother Maurice. Then he was half grateful. She carried him down in soft, safe arms to the kitchen, and asked cook to give him some milk. "Tell me to change back into Maurice," said Maurice, who was quite worn out by his cattish experiences, but no one heard him. What they heard was, meow, meow, meow. Then Maurice saw how he had been tricked. He could be changed back into a boy as soon as anyone said to him, "Leave off being a cat and be Maurice again." But his tongue had no longer the power to ask anyone to say it. He did not sleep well that night. For one thing, he was not accustomed to sleeping on the kitchen hearthrug, and the black beetles were too many and too cordial. He was glad when cook came down and turned him out into the garden, where the October frost still lay white on the yellowed stalks of sunflowers and nasturtiums. He took a walk, climbed a tree, failed to catch a bird, and felt better. He began also to feel hungry. A delicious scent came stealing out of the back kitchen door. Oh, joy! There were to be herrings for breakfast. Maurice hastened in and took his place on his usual chair. His mother said, "Down, puss," and gently tilted the chair so that Maurice fell off it. Then the family had herrings. Maurice said, "You might give me some," and he said it so often that his father, who of course heard only mewings, said, "For goodness' sake, put that cat out of the room." Maurice breakfasted later in the dustbin on herring heads, but he kept himself up with a new and splendid idea. They would give him milk presently, and then they should see. He spent the afternoon sitting on the sofa in the dining-room, listening to the conversation of his father and mother. It is said that listeners never hear any good of themselves. Maurice heard so much that he was surprised and humbled. He heard his father say that he was a fine, plucky little chap, but he needed a severe lesson, and Dr. Strong-o'-the-Arm was the man to give it to him. He heard his mother say things that made his heart throb in his throat and the tears prick behind those green cat eyes of his. He had always thought his parents a little bit unjust. Now they did him so much more than justice that he felt quite small and mean inside his cat skin. "He's a dear, good, affectionate boy," said Mother. "It's only his high spirits. Don't you think, darling, perhaps you were a little hard on him?" "It was for his own good," said Father. "Of course," said Mother, "but I can't bear to think of him at that dreadful school." "Well," Father was beginning, when Jane came in with the tea-things on a clattering tray, whose sound made Maurice tremble in every leg. Father and Mother began to talk about the weather. Maurice felt very affectionately to both his parents. The natural way of showing this was to jump on to the sideboard, and thence on to his father's shoulders. He landed there on his 4 padded feet, light as a feather, but Father was not pleased. "Bother the cat!" he cried. "Jane, put it out of the room." Maurice was put out. His great idea, which was to be carried out with milk, would certainly not be carried out in the dining-room. He sought the kitchen, and seeing a milk-can on the window-ledge, jumped up beside the can and patted it, as he had seen Lord Hugh do. "My!" said a friend of Jane's who happened to be there, "ain't that cat clever? A perfect moral, I call her." "He's nothing to boast of this time," said Cook. "I will say for Lord Hugh, he's not often taken in with a empty can." This was naturally mortifying for Maurice, but he pretended not to hear, and jumped from the window to the tea-table and patted the milk-jug. "Come," said the cook, "that's more like it." And she poured him out a full saucer and set it on the floor. Now was the chance Maurice had longed for. Now he could carry out that idea of his. He was very thirsty, for he had had nothing since that delicious breakfast in the dustbin. But not for worlds would he have drunk the milk, no. He carefully dipped his right paw in it, for his idea was to make letters with it on the kitchen oilcloth. He meant to write, "Please tell me to leave off being a cat and be Maurice again." But he found his paw a very clumsy pen, and he had to rub out the first P because it only looked like an accident. Then he tried again, and actually did make a P that any fair-minded person could have read quite easily. "I wish they'd notice," he said, and before he got the L written they did notice. "Drat the cat," said Cook. "Look how he's messing the floor up." And she took away the milk. Maurice put pride aside and mewed to have the milk put down again, but he did not get it. Very weary, very thirsty, and very tired of being Lord Hugh, he presently found his way to the schoolroom, where Mabel, with patient toil, was doing her home lessons. She took him on her lap and stroked him while she learned her French verbs. He felt that he was growing very fond of her. People were quite right to be kind to dumb animals. Presently she had to stop stroking him and do a map, and after that she kissed him and put him down and went away. All the time she had been doing the map, Maurice had had but one thought: ink. The moment the door had closed behind her, how sensible people were who closed doors gently! He stood up in her chair with one paw on the map and the other on the ink. Unfortunately, the inkstand top was made to dip pens in and not to dip paws, but Maurice was desperate. He deliberately upset the ink, most of it rolled over the tablecloth and fell pattering on the carpet, but with what was left he wrote quite plainly across the map: "Please tell Lord Hugh to stop being a cat and be Maurice again." "There," he said, They can't make any mistake about that. They didn't, but they made a mistake about who had done it, and Mabel was deprived of jam with her supper bread. Her assurance that some naughty boy must have come through the window and done it while she was not there convinced nobody, and indeed the window was shut and bolted. Maurice, wild with indignation, did not mend matters by seizing the opportunity of a few minutes' solitude to write, "It was not Mabel. It was Maurice. I mean Lord Hugh." Because when that was seen, Mabel was instantly sent to bed. "It's not fair," cried Maurice. "My dear," said Maurice's father, "if that cat goes on mewing to this extent, you'll have to get rid of it." Maurice said not another word. It was bad enough to be a cat, but to be a cat that was got rid of. He knew how people got rid of cats. In a stricken silence he left the room and slunk up the stairs. He dared not mew again, even at the door of Mabel's room. But when Jane went in to put Mabel's light out, Maurice crept in too, and in the dark tried, with stifled mews and purrs, to explain to Mabel how sorry he was. Mabel stroked him, and he went to sleep. His last waking thought, amazement at the blindness that had once made him call her a silly little kid. If you have ever been a cat, you will understand something of what Maurice endured during the dreadful days that followed. If you have not, I can never make you understand fully. There was the affair of the fishmonger's tray, balanced on the wall by the back door, the delicious curled-up whiting. Maurice knew as well as you do that one mustn't steal fish out of other people's trays, but the cat that he was didn't know. There was an inward struggle, and Maurice was beaten by the cat nature. Later he was beaten by the cook. Then there was that very painful incident with the butcher's dog, the flight across gardens, the safety of the plum-tree gained only just in time. And worst of all, despair took hold of him, for he saw that nothing he could do would make any one say those simple words that would release him. He had hoped that Mabel might at last be made to understand, but the ink had failed him. She did not understand his subdued mewings, and when he got the cardboard letters and made the same sentence with them, Mabel only thought it was that naughty boy who came through locked windows. Somehow he could not spell before any one. His nerves were not what they had been. His brain now gave him no new ideas. He felt that he was really growing like a cat in his mind. His interest in his meals grew beyond even what it had been when they were a schoolboy's meals. He hunted mice with growing enthusiasm, though the loss of his whiskers to measure narrow places with made hunting difficult. He grew expert in bird-stalking, and often got quite near to a bird before it flew away laughing at him. But all the time in his heart he was very, very miserable, and so the week went by. Maurice, in his cat shape, dreaded more and more the time when Lord Hugh, in the boy shape, should come back from Dr. Strong-i-the-Arms. He knew, who better, exactly the kind of things boys do to cats, and he trembled to the end of his handsome half-Persian tail. And then the boy came home from Dr. Strong-i-the-Arms, and at the first sound of his boots in the hall, Maurice in the cat's body fled with silent haste to hide in the boot-cupboard. Here, 10 minutes later, the boy that had come back from Dr. Strong-i-the-Arms found him. Maurice fluffed up his tail and unsheathed his claws. Whatever this boy was going to do to him, Maurice meant to resist, and his resistance should hurt the boy as much as possible. I am sorry to say Maurice swore softly among the boots, but cat-swearing is not really wrong. "Come out, you old duffer," said Lord Hugh in the boy shape of Maurice. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I'll see to that," said Maurice, backing into the corner, all teeth and claws. "Oh, I've had such a time," said Lord Hugh. "It's no use, you know, old chap. I can see where you are by your green eyes. My word, they do shine. I've been caned and shut up in a dark room and given thousands of lines to write out." "I've been beaten too, if you come to that," mewed Maurice, "besides the butcher's dog." It was an intense relief to speak to someone who could understand his mews. "Well, I suppose it's pax for the future," said Lord Hugh. "If you won't come out, you won't. Please leave off being a cat and be Maurice again." And instantly Maurice, amid a heap of galoshes and old tennis bats, felt with a swelling heart that he was no longer a cat. No more of those undignified forelegs, those tiresome pointed ears, so difficult to wash, that furry coat, that contemptible tail, and that terrible inability to express all one's feelings in 2 words, mew and purr. He scrambled out of the cupboard, and the boots and galoshes fell off him like spray off a bather. He stood upright in those very checkered knickerbockers that were so terrible when their knees held one vice-like, while things were tied to one's tail. He was face to face with another boy, exactly like himself. "You haven't changed, then? But there can't be 2 Maurices." "There shan't be, not if I know it," said the other boy. "A boy's life's a dog's life. Quick, before anyone comes." "Quick what?" asked Maurice. "Why, tell me to leave off being a boy and to be Lord Hugh Cecil again." Maurice told him at once, and at once the boy was gone, and there was Lord Hugh in his own shape, purring politely, yet with a watchful eye on Maurice's movements. "Oh, you needn't be afraid, old chap, it's Pax right enough," Maurice murmured in the ear of Lord Hugh, and Lord Hugh, arching his back under Maurice's stroking hand, replied with a purr meow that spoke volumes. "Oh, Maurice, here you are. It is nice of you to be nice to Lord Hugh when it was because of him you—" "He's a good old chap," said Maurice carelessly, "and you're not half a bad old girl, see?" Mabel almost wept for joy at this magnificent compliment, and Lord Hugh himself took on a more happy and confident air. Please dismiss any fears which you may entertain that after this Maurice became a model boy. He didn't, but he was much nicer than before. The conversation which he overheard when he was a cat makes him more patient with his father and mother, and he is almost always nice to Mabel, for he cannot forget all that she was to him when he wore the shape of Lord Hugh. His father attributes all the improvement in his son's character to that week at Dr. Strongerthearm's, which, as you know, Maurice never had. Lord Hugh's character is unchanged. Cats learn slowly and with difficulty. Only Maurice and Lord Hugh know the truth. Maurice has never told it to anyone except me, and Lord Hugh is a very reserved cat. He never at any time had that free flow of mew which distinguished and endangered the Cat-hood of Maurice. End of The Cat-hood of Maurice by E. Nesbit. The Cat That Walked by Himself by Rudyard Kipling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hear and attend and listen, for this befell and behappened and became and was, O my best beloved, when the tame animals were wild. The dog was wild, and the horse was wild, and the cow was wild, and the sheep was wild, and the pig was wild as wild could be, and they walked in the wet, wild woods by their wild lones. But the wildest of all the wild animals was the cat. He walked by himself, and all places were alike to him. Of course, the man was wild too. He was dreadfully wild. He didn't even begin to be tame till he met the woman, and she told him that she did not like living in his wild ways. She picked out a nice dry cave instead of a heap of wet leaves to lie down in, and she strewed clean sand on the floor, and she lit a nice fire of wood at the back of the cave, and she hung a dried wild horse-skin tail down across the opening of the cave, and she said, "Wipe your feet, dear, when you come in, and now we'll keep house." That night, best beloved, they ate wild sheep roasted on the hot stones, and flavoured with wild garlic and wild pepper, and wild duck stuffed with wild rice, and wild fenugreek, and wild coriander, and marrow bones of wild oxen, and wild cherries, and wild grenadillas. Then the man went to sleep in front of the fire, ever so happy. But the woman sat up, combing her hair. She took the bone of the shoulder of mutton, the big, fat blade bone, and she looked at the wonderful marks on it, and she threw more wood on the fire, and she made a magic. She made the first singing magic in the world. Out in the wet, wild woods, all the wild animals gathered together, where they could see the light of the fire a long way off, and they wondered what it meant. Then Wild Horse stamped with his wild foot and said, "O my friends, and O my enemies, why have the man and the woman made that great light in that great cave, and what harm will it do us?" Wild Dog lifted up his wild nose, and smelled the smell of roast mutton, and said, "I will go up and see and look and say, for I think it is good. Cat, come with me." "Nenny," said the cat, "I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me. I will not come." "Then we can never be friends again," said Wild Dog, and he trotted off to the cave. But when he had gone a little way, the cat said to himself, "All places are alike to me. Why should I not go too, and see, and look, and come away at my own liking?" So he slipped after Wild Dog, softly, very softly, and hid himself where he could hear everything. When Wild Dog reached the mouth of the cave, he lifted up the dried horse-skin with his nose, and sniffed the beautiful smell of the roast mutton, and the woman, looking at the blade bone, heard him and laughed, and said, "Here comes the first wild thing out of the wild woods. What do you want?" Wild Dog said, "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, what is this that smells so good in the wild woods?" Then the woman picked up a roasted mutton bone and threw it to Wild Dog, and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, taste and try." Wild Dog gnawed the bone, and it was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted, and he said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, give me another." The woman said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, help my man to hunt through the day and guard this cave at night, and I will give you as many roast bones as you need." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "this is a very wise woman, but she is not so wise as I am." Wild Dog crawled into the cave and laid his head on the woman's lap and said, "Oh, my friend and wife of my friend, I will help your man to hunt through the day, and at night I will guard your cave." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "that is a very foolish dog." And he went back through the wet, wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone, but he never told anybody. When the man waked up, he said, "What is Wild Dog doing here?" And the woman said, "His name is not Wild Dog any more, but the First Friend, because he will be our friend for always and always and always. Take him with you when you go hunting." Next night the woman cut great green armfuls of fresh grass from the water meadows, and dried it before the fire, so that it smelt like new-mown hay, and she sat at the mouth of the cave and plaited a halter out of horse-hide, and she looked at the shoulder of mutton-bone, at the big, broad blade-bone, and she made a magic. She made the second singing magic in the world. Out in the wild woods, all the wild animals wondered what had happened to Wild Dog, and at last Wild Horse stamped with his foot and said, "I will go and see and say why Wild Dog has not returned. Cat, come with me." "Nenny," said the cat, "I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me. I will not come." But all the same he followed Wild Horse softly, very softly, and hid himself where he could hear everything. When the woman heard Wild Horse tripping and stumbling on his long mane, she laughed and said, "Here comes the second wild thing out of the wild woods. What do you want?" Wild Horse said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, where is Wild Dog?" The woman laughed and picked up the blade-bone and looked at it and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, you did not come here for Wild Dog, but for the sake of this good grass." And Wild Horse, tripping and stumbling on his long mane, said, "That is true. Give it me to eat." The woman said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, bend your wild head and wear what I give you, and you shall eat the wonderful grass 3 times a day." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "this is a clever woman, but she is not so clever as I am." Wild Horse bent his wild head, and the woman slipped the plaited hide halter over it, and Wild Horse breathed on the woman's feet and said, "Oh, my mistress and wife of my master, I will be your servant for the sake of the wonderful grass." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "That is a very foolish horse." And he went back through the wet, wild woods, waving his wild tail, and walking by his wild lone. But he never told anybody. When the man and the dog came back from hunting, the man said, "What is Wild Horse doing here?" And the woman said, "His name is not Wild Horse any more, but the first servant, because he will carry us from place to place for always and always and always. Ride on his back when you go hunting." Next day, holding her wild head high, that her wild horns should not catch in the wild trees, Wild Cow came up to the cave, and the cat followed, and hid himself just the same as before, and everything happened just the same as before, and the cat said the same things as before, and when Wild Cow had promised to give her milk to the woman every day in exchange for the wonderful grass, the cat went back through the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone, just the same as before, but he never told anybody. And when the man and the horse and the dog came home from hunting and asked the same questions, same as before, the woman said, "Her name is not Wild Cow any more, but the giver of good food. She will give us the warm white milk for always and always and always, and I will take care of her while you and the first friend and the first servant go hunting." Next day the cat waited to see if any other wild thing would go up to the cave, but no one moved in the wet wild woods. So the cat walked there by himself, and he saw the woman milking the cow, and he saw the light of the fire in the cave, and he smelt the smell of the warm white milk. Cat said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, where did Wild Cow go?" The woman laughed and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, go back to the woods again, for I have braided up my hair, and I have put away the magic blade bone, and we have no more need of either friends or servants in our cave." Cat said, "I am not a friend, and I am not a servant. I am the cat who walks by himself, and I wish to come into your cave." Woman said, "Then why did you not come with first friend on the first night?" Cat grew very angry and said, "Has Wild Dog told tales of me?" Then the woman laughed and said, "You are the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to you. You are neither a friend nor a servant. You have said it yourself. Go away and walk by yourself in all places alike." Then Cat pretended to be sorry and said, "Must I never come into the cave? Must I never sit by the warm fire? Must I never drink the warm white milk? You are very wise and very beautiful. You should not be cruel even to a cat." Woman said, "I knew I was wise, but I did not know I was beautiful. So I will make a bargain with you. If ever I say one word in your praise, you may come into the cave. And if you say 2 words in my praise, said the cat. I never shall, said the woman. But if I say 2 words in your praise, you may sit by the fire in the cave. And if you say 3 words, said the cat. I never shall, said the woman. But if I say 3 words in your praise, you may drink the warm white milk 3 times a day, for always and always and always. Then the cat arched his back and said, Now let the curtain at the mouth of the cave, and the fire at the back of the cave, and the milk pots that stand beside the fire remember what my enemy and the wife of my enemy has said. And he went away through the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. That night, when the man and the horse and the dog came home from hunting, the woman did not tell them of the bargain that she had made with the cat, because she was afraid that they might not like it. Cat went far and far away and hid himself in the wet, wild woods by his wild lone for a long time, till the woman forgot all about him. Only the bat, the little upside-down bat that hung inside the cave, knew where Cat hid, and every evening Bat would fly to Cat with news of what was happening. One evening Bat said, There is a baby in the cave. He is new and pink and fat and small, and the woman is very fond of him. Ah, said the cat, listening, but what is the baby fond of? He is fond of things that are soft and tickle, said the bat. He is fond of warm things to hold in his arms when he goes to sleep. He is fond of being played with. He is fond of all those things. Ah, said the cat, listening, then my time has come. Next night Cat walked through the wet wild woods and hid very near the cave till morning time, and man and dog and horse went hunting. The woman was busy cooking that morning, and the baby cried and interrupted. So she carried him outside the cave and gave him a handful of pebbles to play with, but still the baby cried. Then the cat put out his paddy paw and patted the baby on the cheek, and it cooed, and the cat rubbed against its fat knees and tickled it under its fat chin with his tail, and the baby laughed, and the woman heard him and smiled. Then the bat, the little upside-down bat that hung in the mouth of the cave, said, "Oh, my hostess, and wife of my host, and mother of my host's son, a wild thing from the wild woods is most beautifully playing with your baby." "A blessing on that wild thing, whoever he may be," said the woman, straightening her back, "for I was a busy woman this morning, and he has done me a service." That very minute and second, best beloved, the dried horse-skin curtain that was stretched tail down at the mouth of the cave fell down whoosh, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat, and when the woman went to pick it up, lo and behold, the cat was sitting quite comfy inside the cave. "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "it is I, for you have spoken a word in my praise, and now I can sit within the cave for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." The woman was very angry, and shut her lips tight, and took up a spinning-wheel and began to spin. But the baby cried because the cat had gone away, and the woman could not hush it, for it struggled and kicked and grew black in the face. "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "take a strand of the wire that you are spinning, and tie it to your spinning-wheel, and drag it along the floor, and I will show you a magic that shall make your baby laugh as loudly as he is now crying." "I will do so," said the woman, "because I am at my wit's end, but I will not thank you for it." She tied the thread to the little clay spindle wall, and drew it across the floor, and the cat ran after it, and patted it with his paws, and rolled head over heels, and tossed it backward over his shoulder, and chased it between his hind legs, and pretended to lose it, and pounced down upon it again, till the baby laughed as loudly as it had been crying, and scrambled after the cat, and frolicked all over the cave, till it grew tired, and settled down to sleep with the cat in its arms. "Now," said the cat, "I will sing the baby a song that shall keep him asleep for an hour." And he began to purr, loud and low, low and loud, till the baby fell fast asleep. The woman smiled as she looked down upon the two of them, and said, "That was wonderfully done. No question but you are very clever, O cat." That very minute and second, best beloved, the smoke of the fire at the back of the cave came down in clouds from the roof, puff, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat, and when it had cleared away, lo and behold, the cat was sitting quite comfy close to the fire. "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "it is I, for you have spoken a second word in my praise, and now I can sit by the warm fire at the back of the cave for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." Then the woman was very, very angry, and let down her hair, and put more wood on the fire, and brought out the broad blade-bone of the shoulder of mutton, and began to make a magic that should prevent her from saying a third word in praise of the cat. It was not a singing magic, best beloved, it was a still magic, and by the cave grew so still that a little wee mouse crept out of a corner and ran across the floor. "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "is that little mouse part of your magic?" "Oh, chee! No, indeed," said the woman, and she dropped the blade-bone, and jumped upon the footstool in front of the fire, and braided up her hair very quick, for fear that the mouse should run up it. "Ah," said the cat, watching, "then the mouse will do me no harm if I eat it." "No," said the woman, braiding up her hair, "eat it quickly, and I will ever be grateful to you." Cat made one jump, and caught the little mouse, and the woman said, "100 thanks. Even the first friend is not quick enough to catch little mice as you have done. You must be very wise." That Very moment and second, O best beloved, the milk-pot that stood by the fire cracked in 2 pieces, poof, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat. And when the woman jumped down from the footstool, lo and behold, the cat was lapping up the warm white milk that lay in one of the broken pieces. "O my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "it is I. For you have spoken 3 words in my praise, and now I can drink the warm white milk 3 times a day, for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." Then the woman laughed, and set the cat a bowl of the warm white milk, and said, "O cat, you are as clever as a man, but remember that your bargain was not made with the man or the dog, and I do not know what they will do when they come home." "What is that to me?" said the cat. "If I have my place in the cave by the fire, and my warm white milk 3 times a day, I do not care what the man or the dog can do." That evening, when the man and the dog came into the cave, the woman told them all the story of the bargain, while the cat sat by the fire and smiled. Then the man said, "Yes, but he has not made a bargain with me, or with all proper men after me." Then he took off his 2 leather boots, and he took up his little stone axe, that makes 3, and he fetched a piece of wood and a hatchet, that is 5 altogether, and he set them all out in a row, and he said, "Now we will make our bargain. If you do not catch mice when you are in the cave for always and always and always, I will throw these 5 things at you whenever I see you, and so shall all proper men do after me." "Ah," said the woman, listening, "this is a very clever cat, but he is not so clever as my man." The cat counted the 5 things, and they looked very nobby. And he said, "I will catch mice when I am in the cave for always and always and always, but still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." "Not when I am near," said the man. "If you had not said that last, I would have put all these things away for always and always and always, but I am now going to throw my 2 boots and my little stone axe, that makes 3, at you whenever I meet you, and so shall all proper men do after me." Then the dog said, "Wait a minute. He has not made a bargain with me, or with all proper dogs after me." And he showed his teeth and said, "If you are not kind to the baby while I am in the cave for always and always and always, I will hunt you till I catch you, and when I catch you I will bite you, and so shall all proper dogs do after me." "Ah," said the woman, listening, "this is a very clever cat, but he is not so clever as the dog." Cat counted the dog's teeth, and they looked very pointed, and he said, "I will be kind to the baby while I am in the cave, as long as he does not pull my tail too hard, for always and always and always, but still I am the cat that walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." "Not when I am near," said the dog. "If you had not said that last, I would have shut my mouth for always and always and always, but now I am going to hunt you up a tree whenever I meet you, and so shall all proper dogs do after me." Then the man threw his 2 boots and his little stone axe, that makes 3, at the cat, and the cat ran out of the cave, and the dog chased him up a tree. And from that day to this, best beloved, 3 proper men out of 5 will always throw things at a cat whenever they meet him, and all proper dogs will chase him up a tree. But the cat keeps his side of the bargain too. He will kill mice, and he will be kind to babies when he is in the house, just as long as they do not pull his tail too hard. But when he has done that, and between times, and when the moon gets up and night comes, he is the cat that walks by himself, and all places are alike to him. Then he goes out to the wet wild woods, or up the wet wild trees, or on the wet wild roofs, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. End of The Cat That Walked by Himself, by Rudyard Kipling.
Charlemagne and the Charcoal Burner, by Anonymous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlemagne and the Charcoal Burner. Once the noble Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was riding across a lonely moor with some of his courtiers when they were overtaken by a terrific storm. It became so dark that the party lost sight of one another, and the king found himself alone in the tempest of wind and rain. As he struggled on, he met a poor man leading a horse with two great baskets upon its back. "What is your name, friend?" inquired Charlemagne. "I am Ralph, the Charcoal Burner," replied the man. "Can you tell me where I can find shelter for my horse and myself?" asked the king. "If you care to come with me to my cottage, you will be very welcome," answered Ralph. The king was only too glad to accompany the man to his house in the forest. When they reached the door, the charcoal burner called to his wife to hasten to let them in. Ralph stood aside for his companion to pass in first, but Charlemagne hung back behind. Seeing this, the man took him by the neck and pushed him in the house, saying, "It is only right that my guest should enter first." When the supper was ready, the charcoal burner bade King Charlemagne go to the table before him. But again his majesty held back. Then Ralph gave his visitor such a sound box on the ear that he staggered and fell. "Why will you not do as I bid you?" he asked angrily. "These are strange doings indeed," said the king to himself as he rose from the ground. "Now tell me who you are and where you live," said the peasant to his royal guest. "My name is Usmond, and I live at court, where I have an office with the queen," replied Charlemagne. Early the next morning, Charlemagne, before starting, offered to pay Ralph for his food and lodging, but the man refused to take payment for sheltering one who belonged to the court of the noble king of France. "So be it," answered his majesty. "But if you will not let me pay you, come to the court with a load of coals, and I will see that you sell your goods." "That I will do," answered Ralph. The following day Ralph loaded his mare with 2 large baskets of coal and set off to the court. When he arrived there, he asked for one Ousmond, but no one knew of such a person. The king had given orders that he should be admitted into the palace, and at length he came to a splendid hall, where Charlemagne sat at dinner with his nobles. The poor charcoal burner at once pointed at his majesty, exclaiming, "See, there sits Ousmond, but truly he must be a greater man than he said." At this his majesty burst into a loud laugh, and rising from his seat he told the whole company how he had fared at Ralph's cottage. The lords all laughed heartily, but some of them would have had Ralph punished for having boxed the king's ears. "Nay," said Charlemagne, "heaven forbid I should harm him. He is an honest man who can strike a hard blow, and I shall make him a knight instead." End of Charlemagne and the Charcoal Burner, by Anonymous.
The Forest Witch by Emily Poulsen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Forest Witch. It was in the earliest springtime. In the shade the air was still quite cold, but where the clear and strong sunshine streamed down, one could see that spring had come, for there the blossoms were beginning to stretch upward on their tiny stalks. A couple of children were walking through the forest, a 10-year-old girl named Nina and her little brother Johannes. They were seeking flowers. Nina had to find them because the flowers were too tiny and too much hidden for so small a child as Johannes to discover them for himself. But she always let him have the pleasure of picking them. It was such a joyous spring walk that Nina did not notice how far they were straying away from their grandmother's hut, back of the hill. This little hut had been their home only for a short time. When their dear father and mother died, their grandmother had kindly taken them to live with her, and this was their first walk in the forest. At last Nina thought they ought to go back, but just as she turned around with Johannes by the hand, who should stand before them but a hideous old creature, more glaring and frightful than you can imagine. "What are you doing here, you wretched children?" she shrieked. "Are you plucking flowers in my forest? Then shall I pluck you, you may believe." "Oh, pardon us," cried Nina. "We did not know that we must not pick flowers here. We are strangers in this forest. Pray, pray pardon us." "Snick-a-snack, fiddlestick," answered the terrific old witch, for such the creature was. "Don't talk to me. I never pay any attention to what children say, nor to old folks' talk either. For that matter, indeed I don't. Snick-a-snack, snick-a-snack. But it is not you that I want, silly girl. It is the boy there who has offended me, the little rascal. It is he who picked the flowers. Now I shall take him." "Oh, take me instead," cried Nina in terror, flinging her arms around her brother. "It is my fault. I showed him the flowers and let him pick them. You've no right to take him. Oh, do take me. He is too little." "Snick-a-snack," answered the witch. "What a lot of talk! But you are right. The boy is small to come into my service, so I suppose I shall have to take you. Now listen well to what I say. Spring and summer are coming, and I shall have no work for you then, so I shall not trouble myself about you for the present. But when autumn has come and gone, and all the leaves and flowers have disappeared, then are we very busy in the underground world. Then you may believe that I shall teach you how to work, and I live deep down, very, very deep. Now you may go, but I will make a bargain with you. When the last flower is faded, listen, when the last flower is faded, meet me here on this spot, or, the old witch stopped to think what she could best threaten Nina with. Her wicked eyes glared around for an instant till she noticed that Nina stood with her arms about her little brother, ready to ward off any evil that might come upon him. "Or I shall come and catch this little rascal and twist his arms and legs all out of joint," screamed the witch, shaking her knotty stick at little Johannes. Then, after a dark glance at Nina, she shuffled off through the forest, with the crows shrieking after her, and the leaves and flowers trembling on every side. As soon as the witch was out of sight, Nina hastened home with Johannes. Like a kind sister, she suited her frightened pace to his, so that he should not stumble and fall. The poor little boy had been so terrified at the witch that he had not in the least understood the cruel threats she had used against him, or the dreadful fate which was in store for Nina. Nina was rejoiced that this was so, for then he could not tell their grandmother what the witch had said, and she herself would not disclose the dreadful doom hanging over her. She was determined that the poor grandmother should not be made anxious and sorrowful as long as it could be helped. Shortly after this, the spring burst forth in all its power and beauty, and the blossoms shot up everywhere, in the woods, the fields, the meadows, and the gardens. Nina welcomed them as her dearest friends. They would protect her against the forest witch. So long as she had a single one of these, she would not have to go down into the dark earth to serve the hideous creature. Nina had always loved flowers, but never had she thought so much about them as now. Yet, alas, spring soon turned into summer, and summer went faster than ever before, it seemed to poor Nina. The tears streamed down her cheeks as she saw the blue cornflowers fall before the reaper's scythe, when the grain was cut in harvest time. But Nina could still hope even then, for the roses continued to bloom on grandmother's old rose bush outside the door of the hut. Nina kissed them and begged them to last as long as ever they could, and so they did, the dear friendly roses. When the last little rose had at length withered, autumn had almost passed, and the many-colored leaves were dropping from the trees by thousands. Yet Nina discovered to her joy and comfort that there were flowers still. Along the roadside stood the simple, hardy wild aster, which blossomed on, although the autumn winds and rains destroyed everything else. Winter began, but so mildly that it seemed as if it were still autumn. When the asters finally disappeared, other help came to Nina, for the hazel bush was completely hoaxed by the mild weather and thought it was spring, so it began to unfold its yellow catkins, standing beautiful and bright as one saw it between the bare trees over the hedges. So even when the winter was far advanced, Nina was still saved from going to the witch. But this could not long continue. Cold weather must soon come, because grandmother had said that Christmas was near. And suddenly winter did come in earnest, with its icy frosts and drifting snows. For 5 days it was impossible to get out of the hut, because the wind kept whirling the snow into high drifts all about it. But when the 6th day came, the wind abated, and the snow lay peacefully on the ground. Now Nina dared no longer to stay in the house, for surely all the flowers were dead and buried under the cold snow after this bitter storm. She must go and keep her compact with the witch. So gathering together all her courage, she stole out of the house without being seen by anyone. Outside she stood still for an instant, took a last look at the hut, which now seemed so cozy and dear, whispered farewell, and started on her way to the forest. But she had gathered too little courage after all, for it melted away immediately when she discovered the witch a few steps from the door, standing in the little roadside garden, waiting for her. "You've been rather slow about keeping to your bargain," exclaimed the witch angrily. "I was just coming after you." "Oh, do not make me go with you," cried Nina. In her agony she fell down upon the snow at the witch's great feet, and besought her wildly, "Let me be free. Oh, do let me be free." "Snick-a-snack," snapped the witch. "Up with you. No nonsense." "Is there not a single flower to save me?" wailed Nina. She half rose, and fairly beside herself with fright and despair, began to scrape the snow away from the garden bed at the side of the path, trying to find a flower. "Oh, yes, look if you like. Snick-a-snack, snick-a-snack," laughed the witch, her face glowing with exultation at Nina's trouble. But an instant after, her countenance became filled with fury, for where Nina had cleared the snow away, there appeared a plant with fresh dark green leaves and white flower buds. Nina clasped her hands together in great joy and thankfulness. Then, breaking off a bud, she lifted it up high toward the witch, and rushed away into the hut. The witch, in her disappointment and vexation, sprang about so wildly in the snow that it rose in a cloud all about her, and Nina never saw her again. Safe at home in the little hut, Nina now told all her adventure, and the grandmother took the little girl's sweet, frightened face between her two old hands and kissed her forehead many times. Faithfully every day Nina went to pay a loving visit to the little Christmas rose in the garden, Helleborus niger, for that was the flower which had saved her, and the whole winter long it could be found fresh and beautiful here and there under the snow. Though no other blossoms dare come forth to face the snows and frosts of deep winter, the Christmas rose ventures bravely out into the bleak weather, and with modest and serene courage holds her own against its powers. The snow lying over it keeps it from freezing, and if one brushes away this beautiful covering, the Christmas rose appears with its lovely, white, gold-centered blossoms, laughing at the frost. It blooms steadily on until it can say good-bye to spring's first blossom, the little snowdrop. And so, through all the year, there are flowers blooming in our dear northern land, Denmark. Thus it was that Nina escaped the witch, who, being a forest witch, did not know of the Christmas rose, because that is a garden flower. End of The Forest Witch by Emily Poulsen.
The Frogs and the Ox by Aesop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An ox came down to a reedy pool to drink. As he splashed heavily into the water, he crushed a young frog into the mud. The old frog soon missed the little one and asked his brothers and sisters what had become of him.
"A great big monster," said one of them, "stepped on little brother with one of his huge feet."
"Big was he?" said the old frog, puffing herself up. "Was he as big as this?"
"Oh, much bigger,"
they cried. The frog puffed up still more. "He could not have been bigger than this," she said. But the little frogs all declared that the monster was much, much bigger, and the old frog kept puffing herself out more and more until, all at once, she burst. Do not attempt the impossible. The Frogs and the Ox by Aesop.
Grimbles and the Gnad by C.J. Dennis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Grimbles and the Gnad. It was told me by a bushman, bald and bent and very old, upon the road to pull your leg, and here's the tale he told. 'Twould seem absurd to doubt his word, so honest he appeared, and as he spoke the sou'west wind toyed gently with his beard. First it was the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters, and all we buried in the end was Martin's boots and gaiters. With this cryptic observation he began his anecdote, and when I sought particulars he smiled and cleared his throat. Then sat him down, and with his brown rough hands about his knees he told it all, and as he spoke his beard waved in the breeze. First it was the Grimble grubs, as I says at startin', which they ate his tater crop, which it troubled Martin. Now this Martin was a farmer with a scientific mind. It was thus the bushman started, as his beard blew out behind. He farmed the land, and understand his luck was all tip-top, till them there little Grimble grubs got in his tater crop. Perhaps you've heard of Grimble grubs, more likely perhaps you've not. When once they taste your taters, you can look to lose the lot. And poor Martin he was worried till he met a feller who had read a book about the swook, the which lives in Peru. Now the swook it is a beetle that inhabits wuzzle shrubs, and it makes a steady diet of the little Grimble grubs. So Martin he imported some at very great expense, and turned 'em loose to play the deuce, and teach the Grimble sense. Then he swore by wuzzle swooks, friends of cultivators, which they ate the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters. But when the wuzzle swooks had ate the Grimble grubs right up, then they had to change their habits for to find a bite and sup. So they started on his turnips, which was summat to their taste, till Mr. Martin's turnip patch became a howling waste. That he natural grew peevish till one afternoon he heard from a feller in the poultry line about the guffer bird, which is native of Mauritius and the woods of Tennessee, and preys upon the wuzzle swooks for breakfast, lunch, and tea. So we got sonic guffer birds over from Mauritius, which the same by nature are, greedy and malicious, which they ate the wuzzle swooks, plague of cultivators, which they ate the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters. Then Martin swore by guffer birds until one day he found they'd ate up all the wuzzle swooks for miles and miles around, and having still some appetite and being mighty mean, they perched upon his apple trees and stripped his orchard clean. Here's where Martin got excited. He was in an awful funk, until one day he read about the little warty swunk, which has its home in Mexico and lives on guffer birds, and Martin, being desperate, imported him in herds. Then he praised the warty swunks, beady-eyed and vicious, which they ate the guffer birds, native of Mauritius, which they ate the wuzzle swooks, plague of cultivators, which they ate the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters. Now them swunks were simply wonders, and old Martin stopped his growls, till they ate up all the guffer birds and started on his fowls. And the riots in his henhouse that occurred near every night, they robbed him of his beauty sleep and turned his whiskers white. He was wearing to a shadow till by accident he seen a picture of the boggle dog in some old magazine, and the same he was notorious for hunting swunks and such, and living on their livers, which he fancied very much. Now the boggle dog of Boffin's land is most extremely rare, but Martin mortgaged house and home just to import a pair. They was most ferocious animals, but Martin he was mad, and he sooled 'em on the warty swunks with all the breath he had. Oh, he loved the boggle dogs, called 'em dear and darling, fierce ferocious boggle dogs, with their savage snarling, which they ate the warty swunks, beady-eyed and vicious, which they ate the guffer birds, native of Mauritius, which they ate the wuzzle swooks, plague of cultivators, which they ate the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters. Then Martin he picked up a bit and got his proper sleep, until he found the boggle dogs had taken to his sheep, for warty swunks is hard to catch and nimble on their feet, and livers of merino lambs is just as nice to eat. Now I'm thinking here that Martin must have gone a trifle mad, else he'd never have imported such a creature as the Gnad, for the Gnad, though few folks know it, roams about the Boffin bogs, and he has a passing fancy for the flesh of boggle dogs. But Martin he imported one with his last bit of cash, and loosed 'em on the boggle dogs, an action worse than rash. But the boggles stayed in hiding, for the boggles were discreet, and the Gnad he cast an eye around for something he could eat. "Solemn Towser!" shouted Martin, dancing mid his ravaged crops, But the Gnad regarded Martin as he slowly licked his chops, and the last we seen of Martin, far as I can call to mind, he was tearing round his paddock with the Gnad just close behind. First it was the Grimble grubs, which they ate his taters, then it was the wuzzle swooks, plague of cultivators, then it was the guffer birds, native of Mauritius, then it was the warty swunks, beady-eyed and vicious, then it was the boggled dogs with their snarls and snortin', till the bad voracious Gnad finished his important. And all because the Grimble grubs they got into his taters, we never found a stitch of him but blucher boots and gaiters. Thus the bushman closed his story with a sympathetic sigh, then wrung my hand most heartily and sadly said goodbye. And as he went 'twas evident that he was ill at ease. He bowed his head, and as I've said, his beard waved in the breeze. End of Grimbles and the Gnad by C.J. Dennis. Recording by Son of the Exiles.
Jumpo and the Ice Cream by Howard R. Garris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel
and Super Coconut.
Jumpo and the Ice Cream. It was a few days after Jumpo Kinkytail, the little green monkey boy, had been taken ill with the sniffle-snuffles, and now he was all better, for the hot peanuts had made him well. He and his brother Jacko, the red monkey, were hurrying along the road together to get to school before the last bell rang.
"For we must not be late,"
said Jumpo.
"No, indeed,"
agreed Jacko.
"Shall I carry your books for you, Jumpo? You're not yet strong from having been ill."
"Thank you. I'll be glad to have you carry them,"
said Jumpo politely, so Jacko put his brother's books in the loop of his tail together with his own, and they got to school just as the doors were being closed. "Now, the class in number work will recite," said the owl teacher as she took a piece of blue chalk and went to the blackboard. "If I had 2 apples and Jacko Kinkytail gave me 3 more, how many would I have?" asked the teacher, and she wrote a big figure 2 on the blackboard, and under it a big 3. "You may answer, Jumpo," she said. Jumpo thought for a few seconds. "Well, can't you tell?" asked the owl kindly.
"If you please,"
said Jumpo after a bit.
"It can't be apples that Jacko would give you, because it's pears that Jacko has in his pocket. 3 pears. I saw Mama give them to him for recess. I can't add pears and apples together."
Well, the whole class laughed at that, and the teacher said, "I was only making believe, Jumpo, just as when Uncle Wiggily Longears pretends as he tells you a story. However, we will say 2 pears and 3 pears, if that will suit you better. You may come to the board and add up this sum for me." So Jumpo went to the board, and he took the piece of blue chalk in his left paw, and then he couldn't seem to help doing a funny trick. When the teacher wasn't looking, he reached over, and with his tail he took an eraser and erased the numbers from another part of the board, where Jenny Chipmunk was doing a sum in arithmetic. So Jenny didn't have any numbers to add up, and she cried out, "Oh, dear!" "What's the matter?" asked the teacher quickly, and then, turning around, she saw the mischief Jumpo had done. "You may go to your seat," she said to the green monkey, sad-like, "and you must stay in after school. Sammy Littletail, you may finish the sum on which Jumpo started. He is too playful today." At first Jumpo thought it was fun to have rubbed out Jenny Chipmunk's numbers with his tail, and then he felt sorry. He was more sorry as his brother and all the other pupils went out when school was done, and he had to stay in the room. He could hear the boys having a ball game, and the girls were playing tag, and Jumpo wished he hadn't been bad. But that's the way it is sometimes in this world. After a bit the teacher said, "You may go now, Jumpo. Tomorrow please try a little harder to be good. I know you can if you will."
"Yes,
was all Jumpo said. It was quite late when he got out, and all the boys and girls had gone home. Jumpo thought he might as well go home too, but as it was getting dark he didn't go through the woods. Instead, he went around by way of Grandfather Goosey Gander's home. Now, not far from where the old gentleman Gander lived, there was a bad fox who had built himself a bungalow. And he was a very rich fox, having ice cream for supper nearly every night. Still, he was never satisfied. He wanted a goose, or a rabbit, or a squirrel, or a monkey, or something like that. So when he looked out of his bungalow window and saw Jumpo Kinkytail coming along, this fox said to himself, "Aha! Perhaps I can have a monkey supper tonight. I must catch that little green chap. Still the sly fox knew better than to rush out and try to grab the monkey. I must play a trick on him, he said to himself. What shall I do? Now, outside the fox's bungalow was a freezer full of ice cream ready for his supper. Quickly taking out the can with the ice cream in it, the fox left nothing there but the wooden tub filled with freezing ice and salt. On this he put a sign which read, Help yourself to ice cream. Well, of course, when Jumpo saw that sign, he thought he would take some ice cream.
I'll eat it,
he said,
and bring some home to my mama and papa and Jacko. Oh, someone was very kind to leave this here for me.
You see, he didn't know the trick the fox had made up to catch him. Into the freezing mixture of ice and salt poor Jumpo plunged his paw, and in an instant it was frozen fast there, and he couldn't get it out, as the late afternoon was cold. Pull and pull as he did, the little green monkey was held fast, just as if he was in a trap.
Oh dear! This is terrible! Oh, it isn't ice cream at all! It's just ice and I'm frozen fast! Will no one help me?
Cried Jumpo. No, said the fox, no one will, and when it gets dark enough so no one can see me, I'm coming out to get you and eat you. I have you fast, just where I want you. And indeed it did seem so, for the harder Jumpo pulled, the tighter he was held. He begged and pleaded, but it was of no use. It got darker and darker, and the fox was just coming out with a hatchet to chop Jumpo's paw out of the ice so he could take him inside the bungalow stump, when, all of a sudden, Grandfather Goosey Gander heard the monkey boy's cries. "That is someone in trouble!" exclaimed the old gander gentleman as he put back on the stove the hot flat-iron with which he was ironing his silk hat ready for Sunday. So he opened the door and called, "What's the trouble?"
I'm frozen fast in the ice cream tub, and the fox is going to catch me!"
cried Jumpo. "Ha, hum, we'll see about that!" shouted Grandfather Goosey Gander. In an instant he caught up the hot flat-iron off the stove, and out he ran. Then, before the fox could get the monkey boy, the goose gentleman had put the hot flat-iron on the ice in the tub, taking care not to burn Jumpo. And there was a sizzling, hissing sound, and in another instant the ice was melted because of the hot flat-iron, and Jumpo was free. Then he ran to Grandfather Goosey Gander's house with the old gentleman, and the fox didn't get him, and pretty soon Jumpo went home to tell the folks all about it. And for some time after that, Jumpo was a good monkey boy in school. Now, in the next story I'm going to tell you about Jacko and the paper bag. That is, if the sofa cushion doesn't get tangled up in the lamp chimney and spoil the pudding for supper. End of Jumpo and the Ice Cream by Howard R. Garris.
The Lightning Fiend by Robert Barr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. He was a good little boy, was Tom, a quiet, thoughtful, nice little fellow, who never gave his parents any trouble, and never got into mischief. In fact, just such another boy as the lad who is reading this story. He lived a long time ago in a small cottage with his father and mother, who had no other children. His father was a working man, and his mother had to work also, for they kept no servant. One afternoon his mother went out to meet his father, and said she could not take Tom along with her because it looked so much like rain. She knew that Tom would not be frightened at being left alone in the house, for he was a lonely little boy, and not used to having companions. He was afraid of only one thing, and that was thunder. When the thunder rolled and crashed, Tom was apt to become rather pale, and to be even more silent than usual. However, he was not in the least frightened of the lightning, and loved to watch it from the window. If it were not for the curious coincidence that thunder always accompanied the lightning, he would have enjoyed the storm exceedingly. But as it was, the pleasure he had in looking at the lightning was almost counterbalanced by his fear of the thunder. For some time after his mother left him, Tom gazed out of the window until he noticed it was growing dark. Then he heard the distant rumble of the thunder, and he did not like it. He kept saying to himself, "Mamma, mamma, mamma," as if there were comfort in the reiteration of the word, and he hoped she would hurry home when she saw the storm coming on. Suddenly the dark sky was lit by a vivid flash of lightning, and the thunder rolled heavily and nearer. There was an interval of darkness, then the whole sky became a dome of flame, the thunder crashing quickly after it. Poor Tom turned away from the window and sat down in the middle of the room. He admitted to himself that he was very much frightened, but thought he was not crying, although he could not account to himself for the tears that steadily flowed down his cheeks. There was an ominous silence for a few minutes, then the room became filled with an intense, quivering light, and the world seemed to split in two with the most awful crash Tom had ever heard. Tom would have shrieked with fear had it not been for a strange thing that immediately happened, and which riveted his attention. All the blinding light in the room concentrated in one spot, near the place he was sitting. At first he thought it was a huge ball of fire, but as he looked closer he saw that it was a grotesque human shape, such as he had seen in fairy picture books, only, in this case, the shape seemed to be made of glowing, melting fire. Sparks shot from its eyes like little lightning darts. It leered at Tom with a wide grin on its mouth, and then it shouted, "Ha ha ha, yah!" And as it did so the thunder rolled along the ceiling of the room, and Tom thought this was rather an uncomfortable visitor whose laughter caused thunder. "You don't know me," said the goblin to Tom, with a malicious glare. "No, I don't," admitted Tom. "Well, I'll tell you who I am. I'm the Lightning Fiend. What do you think of that?" "Oh, I like lightning," said Tom, anxious not to offend the goblin, "but I'm afraid of thunder." The Fiend laughed at this, and again the thunder rolled through the room. "That shows what a silly boy you are. I'm the one to fear. Thunder couldn't hurt you, but if I were to point my finger at you, you would drop dead." "Oh, dear me," said Tom in alarm. "I didn't know that." Then the Lightning Fiend spread out his hands, and from the ends of its glowing fingers sparks flew in every direction. The Fiend was floating midway between the floor and the ceiling. It reached up its right hand, with the forefinger extended, and touched the ceiling. Some plaster fell, and blue smoke curled out from where the finger had rested. Then the Fiend reached down with his right foot until the toes touched the carpet. Flame and smoke rose from the spot, and the room was filled with the smell of burning wool. "Oh, don't do that!" cried Tom. "Mother wouldn't like it. She'll be very angry if the carpet is burned." The Fiend laughed again, and again the thunder rolled overhead. "Much I care for your mother, or your father either," he said. "I'm not afraid of them, but they're afraid of me." Tom now realized what a desperate goblin he had to deal with, who was afraid of neither his father nor his mother. "I can do a million things your father cannot do," bragged the Fiend, with a malicious leer. "I can go 1,000 miles while your father is taking a step." The Fiend saw that, frightened as Tom was, he did not believe this, for Tom knew his father to be the greatest man in all the world, and that nobody could do the things which he could. But he did not dare to contradict a Fiend who was powerful enough to set fire to the house by merely touching it with his toe, and so he was silent. The Fiend seemed to read Tom's thoughts, for he said, "Oh, I see you don't believe that, so I'll show you what I can do. I'll go 10 miles and be back here before you can wink." And with a shriek the Fiend shot out of the room. There was an instant's crackle as he left, and in another instant he was back, grinning at Tom. "There," he said, "I've been 10 miles away. I touched a tree and it blazed up like a powder magazine. Coming back, my foot rested for the 100th part of a second on a barn, and now look at it." Tom gazed out of the window, and sure enough their neighbour's barn was in flames. He shuddered as he recognised the power the goblin possessed. Nevertheless, he was a brave little boy, and he asked, with some unconscious contempt in his voice, "Is that all you can do? To go about burning people's things is not very nice. At least, I don't think so." "Oh no, that's not all I can do," said the Fiend, again laughing his thundery laugh. "I frighten little boys sometimes. You are as frightened as you can be now." "Yes, I know I am," said Tom quaveringly. "But if I were as powerful as you are, I wouldn't go about frightening little boys. Anybody can do that." "Oh ho!" shouted the Fiend, apparently not liking what Tom said. "I haven't shown you yet what fright is. What I have done is nothing to what I can do, and since you dare to talk to me like that, I'll teach you a lesson." He shrieked, and with that the Fiend split into 1,000 pieces with the most awful crash that anyone ever heard. The room seemed to fill with flame, and the yell of the Fiend was so terrible that Tom threw up his arm to cover his eyes, and fell fainting to the floor. His father and mother were hurrying home through the rain. They saw the light of the burning barn, and it made them very anxious. At last, coming in sight of their own cottage, they were horrified to see flames breaking through the roof. The mother gave a cry of despair as they both pressed forward, realizing that their only son was locked up in the burning house. Without waiting for the key, the father put his shoulder to the door and forced it open, for he was a very strong man. The house was filled with smoke, and he had great difficulty in making his way to the small parlour, where, by the light of the flames, he saw his little boy lying on the carpet, his head resting on his arm. The father quickly raised the insensible child in his arms, and carried him from the burning house. There was no shelter for them, and all they could do was to stand in the pouring rain and watch the destruction of their home. It was a terrible thing for the Lightning Fiend to have done, for in the cottage was everything the poor people possessed. The mother took the boy and rocked him in her arms. The cold rain splashing on his face quickly revived him, and he was soon able to tell his parents what he had seen and what the Fiend had said to him. They looked one at the other, and the mother began to weep. She was afraid their boy had lost his mind. But that turned out not to be the case, for when Tom grew up he became one of the famous men of the day. His name travelled all over the world. He was a great electrician, inventing many useful things, and the man who invents useful articles gathers wealth. So Tom was rich, rejoicing in having money, because he had a boy of his own to whom he could give advantages he had not himself possessed when he was young. When Tom the Second was the same age as Tom the First had been at the time of the Lightning Fiend's visit, his father took him on his knee and told him the story that I have set down. Young Tom was greatly interested, and watched his father with wide-open eyes as he told the story of the Lightning Fiend. "Why do you say, father, that you thought you saw the goblin? Aren't you sure you saw it?" "I was sure at the time, my boy, but I have thought since that it may have been a dream I had while I was falling to the floor." Young Tom pondered over this for a while, and at last said, "I would rather believe, father, that you really saw the goblin." "Well, perhaps I did," said the father thoughtfully. "In fact, I am never quite sure whether I saw it or not, so we will take it for granted that I did, if you like it better." And so young Tom went up to his room thinking deeply of the goblin story. He wondered whether or not he would be afraid if a goblin visited him. Young Tom possessed a much finer room than the one in which his father saw the goblin, for, as I have said, his father was rich, while his grandfather had been very poor. It had been years before his grandfather recovered from the loss caused by the burning of his cottage. Tom felt glad that his grandfather was still alive to enjoy the comforts now provided for him. There was an easy chair in Tom's room, and he seated himself in it and thought over the goblin's story until he felt a little bit frightened, for the room was growing dark. He then arose and pressed a button that rang a bell downstairs. In a little time a servant rapped lightly at the door. "Did you ring, Master Tom?" she asked. "Yes, Betty. It is getting dark, and father doesn't like me to meddle with the light." The maid walked to a projection in the wall, and, giving it a slight turn, the chandelier was instantly illuminated, flooding the apartment with light. Tom seated himself again before the fire, and the servant went downstairs. All at once Tom noticed the electric lights of the chandelier growing dimmer and dimmer. He was surprised at this, but his surprise increased when, on looking up at the chandelier, he saw hanging from it by the hands a curious object, which glowed in the semi-darkness as if it had been rubbed with phosphorus. Tom at once recognized it as the Lightning Fiend, although he felt sure it was much changed from what it had been when his father had seen it. Its long arms were thin and lean, and in its face was a look of fear. It seemed afraid to let go of the chandelier, but at last it did so, and fell upon the table. It sat up presently, and drew its hand wearily across its brow. Seeing that Tom was looking, it drew a deep sigh. "You are the Lightning Fiend," said Tom, by way of beginning a conversation. "Alas, yes," said the goblin, again mopping its brow. "Well, if you think to frighten me," said Tom, "you will find yourself disappointed. I know all about you. You are negative and positive, and if you go round a piece of soft iron by means of an insulated copper wire, you make that iron a magnet. You can be produced by a dynamo revolving rapidly. It brings you up out of the ground. And we can also make you by different chemical solutions. You see, I know all about you, and you can't frighten me as you did my father a long time ago. If I were to stand on a sheet of plate glass you couldn't even touch me. You can't frighten him now," said Tom, who had the same confidence in his father that most little boys have in theirs. "No," said the Fiend, dejectedly, "I don't want to frighten anybody. The frightening of your father was the greatest mistake of my life. I am very sorry I did it. No one can be more sorry." "I don't wonder at it," said Tom, "for you burnt my grandfather's house, and he was very poor then." "Oh, I don't know that I mind the burning of the house so much," said the Fiend, with some return of his old jauntiness. "I have burnt lots of houses and will again. It's about the only fun I have left. It is the frightening of your father I regret, not on his account either, because, you see, I'm a selfish brute. It is because he has set me to work that I am sorry. I had nothing at all to do when your father was a boy, but now I am almost worked to death. Even when a little boy like you pressed that button, I had to jump right down to the kitchen and tell the servant you wanted her, and that is not the worst of it." "Well, what is the worst of it?" asked Tom. "I have to do heavy work all day. Those street trams that run past your door with a wire above them, I have to pull. I have to run them filled with people from early morning until late at night, until all the people are home from the theatres, and it is very hard work, I tell you. But that isn't the worst of it," he added, as he drew his hand again across his anxious brow. "Well, what is it?" asked Tom, growing very curious to know what might be the very worst of it. "Long before the street-cars stop, I have to light up the whole city and keep it lighted until daybreak. Think of that! but that isn't the worst of it." "I shouldn't think that anything could be worse than having to work both night and day," said Tom. "Most people have to work only in the daytime." "Ah, but there's no rest for me," said the Goblin, sighing. "All night long, as well as all day, I have to carry messages. Any little boy can call me up. I have to plunge under the sea and carry the news to all parts of the world. People used to be satisfied when a steamer brought the news across the ocean in 8 or 9 days, but if I am half a second carrying it to any part of the world, they think I am slow. And then I have to look after the signals of all the railways in the world. But that isn't the worst of it." "Dear me," said Tom, wonderingly. "Whatever is it then?" "Well, I run motors that drive sewing machines, fans, and all sorts of machinery, so that with lighting, message carrying, and all that I have to do, what I fear is that your father will go on inventing more work for me. And that's the worst of it," said the Fiend, sighing heavily. "Well, you won't have time to frighten any more little boys, then," said Tom. "Oh, don't talk about that any more," said the Fiend angrily. "I've had enough of it. If I had never frightened your father I would never have had all this work to do, and he perhaps would not be the greatest electrician in the world." "Hark!" said the Fiend, after a pause. "That is your father's step. I must go." He caught hold of the chandelier, swung himself up, and immediately the lights blazed up in the room. "Well, I'm glad," said Tommy, "to know the worst of it." "So ho, my boy, you've been asleep," said his father as he entered the room and saw Tom blinking at him. "Oh no, father. I was just thinking over that Goblin story, and, very strangely, while I was thinking, the Goblin came. He remembered you, and was sorry he had frightened you. So, you see, it was true, and you did see him." "Really?" said the father, and he smiled at his son's earnestness. "And how did he look? Just the same as when I saw him?" "No, father, he was tired out. He has to work night and day, and he doesn't like it." "Well, Tom, then this is a secret between you and me. We've both seen the Goblin in the 2 stages of his existence. And now," stroking Tom's curly head, "when little boys begin to see goblins, it is time to go to bed." And so Tom went to bed, and what he dreamed about that night you may easily guess. End of The Lightning Fiend by Robert Barr.
The Moon and Her Mother by Aesop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Darth Vader. The Moon once begged her mother to make her a gown. "How can I?" replied she. "There is no fitting your figure. At one time you're a new moon, and at another you're a full moon, and between whiles you're neither one nor the other." End of The Moon and Her Mother by Aesop.
The Sing-Song of Old Man Kangaroo by Rudyard Kipling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Addison. The Sing-Song of Old Man Kangaroo. Not always was the kangaroo as now we do behold him, but a different animal with 4 short legs. He was grey and he was woolly, and his pride was inordinate. He danced on an outcrop in the middle of Australia, and he went to the little god Nakwa. He went to Nakwa at 6 before breakfast, saying, make me different from all other animals by 5 this afternoon. Up jumped Naqua from his seat on the sandflat and shouted, "Go away!" He was grey, and he was woolly, and his pride was inordinate. He danced on a rock ledge in the middle of Australia, and he went to the middle god Naqwing. He went to Naqwing at 8 after breakfast, saying, "Make me different from all other animals. Make me also wonderfully popular by 5 this afternoon." Up jumped Naqwing from his burrow in the spinifex and shouted, "Go away!" He was grey and he was woolly, and his pride was inordinate. He danced on a sandbank in the middle of Australia, and he went to the big god Naqwang. He went to Naqwang at 10 before dinner time, saying, "Make me different from all other animals. Make me popular and wonderfully run after by 5 this afternoon." Up jumped Naqwang from his bath in the salt pan and shouted, "Yes, I will." Naqwang called Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, always hungry, dusty in the sunshine, and showed him Kangaroo. Naqwang said, "Dingo, wake up, Dingo. Do you see that gentleman dancing on an ash pit? He wants to be popular and very truly run after. Dingo, make him so." Up jumped Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, and said, "What, that cat rabbit?" Off ran Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, always hungry, grinning like a coal scuttle, ran after Kangaroo. Off went the proud Kangaroo on his 4 little legs like a bunny. This, O beloved of mine, ends the first part of the tale. He ran through the desert, he ran through the mountains, he ran through the salt pans, he ran through the reed beds, he ran through the blue gums, he ran through the spinifex, he ran till his front legs ached. He had to. Still ran Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, always hungry, grinning like a rat trap, never getting nearer, never getting farther, ran after Kangaroo. He had to. Still ran Kangaroo, old man Kangaroo. He ran through the tea trees, he ran through the mulga, he ran through the long grass, he ran through the short grass, he ran through the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer. He ran till his hind legs ached. He had to. Still ran Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, hungrier and hungrier, grinning like a horse collar, never getting nearer, never getting farther, and they came to the Wollgong River. Now there wasn't any bridge, and there wasn't any ferry boat, and Kangaroo didn't know how to get over, so he stood on his legs and hopped. He had to. He hopped through the flinders, he hopped through the cinders, he hopped through the deserts in the middle of Australia. He hopped like a kangaroo. First he hopped 1 yard, then he hopped 3 yards, then he hopped 5 yards, his legs growing stronger, his legs growing longer. He hadn't any time for rest or refreshment, and he wanted them very much. Still ran Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, very much bewildered, very much hungry, and wondering what in the world or out of it made old man Kangaroo hop. For he hopped like a cricket, like a pea in a saucepan, or a new rubber ball on the nursery floor. He had to. He tucked up his front legs, he hopped on his hind legs, he stuck out his tail for a balance weight behind him, and he hopped through the Darling Downs. He had to. Still ran Dingo, tired dog Dingo, hungrier and hungrier, very much bewildered, and wondering when in the world or out of it would Old Man Kangaroo stop. Then came Nquong from his bath in the salt pans and said, "It's 5 o'clock." Down sat Dingo, poor dog Dingo, always hungry, dusky in the sunshine, hung out his tongue and howled. Down sat Kangaroo, Old Man Kangaroo, stuck out his tail like a milking stool behind him, and said, "Thank goodness that's finished." Then said Nquong, who was always a gentleman, "Why aren't you grateful to Yellow Dog Dingo? Why don't you thank him for all he has done for you?" Then said Kangaroo, tired old Kangaroo, "He's chased me out of the homes of my childhood. He's chased me out of my regular meal times. He's altered my shape so I'll never get it back. And he's played old scratch with my legs." Then said Nquong, "Perhaps I'm mistaken, but didn't you ask me to make you different from all other animals, as well as to make you very truly sought after? And now it is 5 o'clock." "Yes," said Kangaroo, "I wish that I hadn't. I thought you would do it by charms and incantations, but this is a practical joke." "Joke?" said Nquong from his bath in the blue gums. "Say that again, and I'll whistle up Dingo and run your hind legs off." "No," said the Kangaroo, "I must apologize. Legs are legs, and you needn't alter 'em so far as I am concerned. I only meant to explain to your lordliness that I've had nothing to eat since morning, and I'm very empty indeed." "Yes," said Dingo, Yellow Dog Dingo, "I am just in the same situation. I've made him different from all other animals, but what may I have for my tea?" Then said Nquong from his bath in the salt pan, "Come and ask me about it tomorrow, because I'm going to wash." So they were left in the middle of Australia, Old Man Kangaroo and Yellow Dog Dingo, and each said, "That's your fault." End of the sing-song of Old Man Kangaroo by Rudyard Kipling.
The Patchwork School by Mary E. Wilkins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. The Patchwork School by Mary E. Wilkins. Once upon a time there was a city which possessed a very celebrated institution for the reformation of unruly children. It was, strictly speaking, a reform school, but of a very peculiar kind. It had been established years before by a benevolent lady who had a great deal of money and wished to do good with it. After thinking a long time, she had hit upon this plan of founding a school for the improvement of children who tried their parents and all their friends by their ill behavior. More especially, it was designed for ungrateful and discontented children. Indeed, it was mainly composed of this last class. There was a special set of police in the city, whose whole duty was to keep a sharp lookout for ill-natured, fretting children, who complained of their parents' treatment, and thought other boys and girls were much better off than they, and to march them away to the school. These police all wore white top boots, tall peaked hats, and carried sticks with blue ribbon bows on them, and were very readily distinguished. Many a little boy on his way to school has dodged round a corner to avoid one, because he had just been telling his mother that another little boy's mother gave him twice as much pie for dinner as he had. He wouldn't breathe easy till he had left the white top boots out of sight. and he would tremble all day at every knock on the door. There was not a child in the city but had a great horror of this school, though it may seem rather strange that they should, for the punishment, at first thought, did not seem so very terrible. Ever since it was established, the school had been in charge of a very singular little old woman. Nobody had ever known where she came from. The benevolent lady who founded the institution had brought her to the door one morning in her coach, and the neighbors had seen the little brown wizened creature with a most extraordinary gown on, alight and enter. This was all any one had ever known about her. In fact, the benevolent lady had come upon her in the course of her travels in a little German town, sitting in a garret window, behind a little box garden of violets, sewing patchwork. After that she became acquainted with her, and finally hired her to superintend her school. You see, the benevolent lady had a very tender heart, and though she wanted to reform the naughty children of her native city and have them grow up to be good men and women, she did not want them to be shaken, nor have their ears cuffed. So the ideas advanced by the strange little old woman just suited her. "Set 'em to sewing patchwork," said this little old woman, sewing patchwork vigorously herself as she spoke. She was dressed in a gown of bright-colored patchwork, with a patchwork shawl over her shoulders. Her cap was made of tiny squares of patchwork, too. "If they are sewing patchwork," went on the little old woman, "they can't be in mischief. Just make 'em sit in little chairs and sew patchwork, boys and girls alike. Make 'em sit and sew patchwork when the bees are flying over the clover out in the bright sunlight, and the great blue-winged butterflies stop with the roses just outside the windows, and the robins are singing in the cherry trees, and they'll turn over a new leaf, you'll see," sewing away with a will. So the school was founded, the strange little old woman placed over it, and it really worked admirably. It was the pride of the city. Strangers who visited it were always taken to visit the Patchwork School, for that was the name it went by. There sat the children in their little chairs, sewing patchwork. They were dressed in little patchwork uniforms. The girls wore blue and white patchwork frocks, and pink and white patchwork pinafores, and the boys blue and white patchwork trousers with pinafores like the girls. Their cheeks were round and rosy, for they had plenty to eat, bread and milk 3 times a day, but they looked sad, and tears were standing in the corners of a good many eyes. How could they help it? It did seem as if the loveliest roses in the whole country were blossoming in the garden of the Patchwork School, and there were swarms of hummingbirds flying over them, and great red and blue-winged butterflies, and there were tall cherry trees a little way from the window, and they used to be perfectly crimson with fruit, and the way the robins would sing in them. Later in the season there were apple and peach trees too, the apples and great rosy peaches fairly dragging the branches to the ground, and all in sight from the window of the schoolroom. No wonder the poor little culprits cooped up indoors sewing red and blue and green pieces of calico together looked sad. Every day bales of calico were left at the door of the Patchwork School, and it all had to be cut up in little bits and sewed together again. When the children heard the heavy tread of the porters bringing in the bales of new calico, the tears would leave the corners of their eyes and trickle down their poor little cheeks at the prospect of the additional work they would have to do. All the patchwork had to be sewed over and over, and every crooked or too long stitch had to be picked out, for the patchwork woman was very particular. They had to make all their own clothes of patchwork, and after those were done, patchwork bedquilts, which were given to the city poor. So the benevolent lady killed 2 birds with 1 stone, as you might say. Of course, children stayed in the Patchwork School different lengths of time, according to their different offences. But there were very few children in the city who had not sat in a little chair and sewed patchwork at one time or another, for a greater or less period. Sooner or later the best children were sure to think they were ill-treated by their parents, and had to go to bed earlier than they ought, or did not have as much candy as other children, and the police would hear them grumbling, and drag them off to the Patchwork School. The mayor's son, especially, who might be supposed to fare as well as any little boy in the city, had been in the school any number of times. There was one little boy in the city, however, whom the white-booted police had not yet found any occasion to arrest, though one might have thought he had more reason than a good many others to complain of his lot in life. In the first place, he had a girl's name, and anyone knows that would be a great cross to a boy. His name was Julia. His parents had called him so on account of his having a maiden aunt who had promised to leave her money to him if he was named for her. So there was no help for it. But it was a great trial to him, for the other boys plagued him unmercifully, and called him Missy and Sissy, and said she instead of he when they were speaking of him. Still he never complained to his parents, and told them he wished they had called him some other name. His parents were very poor, hard-working people, and Julia had much coarser clothes than the other boys, and plainer food, but he was always cheerful about it, and never seemed to think it at all hard that he could not have a velvet coat like the mayor's son, or carry cakes for lunch to school like the lawyer's little boy. But perhaps the greatest cross which Julia had to bear, and the one from which he stood in the greatest danger of getting into the Patchwork School, was his grandmother's. I don't mean to say that grandmothers are to be considered usually as crosses. A dear old lady seated with her knitting beside the fire is a pleasant person to have in the house. But Julia had 4, and he had to hunt for their spectacles and pick up their balls of yarn so much that he got very little time to play. It was an unusual thing, but the families on both sides were very long-lived, and there actually were 4 grandmothers, 2 great ones and 2 common ones, 2 on each side of the fireplace, with their knitting work, in Julia's home. They were nice old ladies, and Julia loved them dearly, but they lost their spectacles all the time, and were always dropping their balls of yarn, and it did make a deal of work for one boy to do. He could have hunted up spectacles for one grandmother, but when it came to 4, and one was always losing hers while he was finding another's, and one ball of yarn would drop and roll off while he was picking up another, well, it was really bewildering at times. Then he had to hold the skeins of yarn for them to wind, and his arms used to ache, and he could hear the boys shouting at a game of ball outdoors, maybe. But he never refused to do anything his grandmothers asked him to do, and did it pleasantly, too, and it was not on that account he got into the Patchwork School. It was on Christmas Day that Julia was arrested and led away to the Patchwork School. It happened in this way. As I said before, Julia's parents were poor, and it was all they could do to procure the bare comforts of life for their family. There was very little to spend for knick-knacks. But I don't think Julia would have complained at that. He would have liked useful articles just as well for Christmas presents, and would not have been unhappy because he did not find some useless toy in his stocking, instead of some article of clothing which he needed to make him comfortable. But he had had the same things over and over and over, Christmas after Christmas. Every year each of his grandmothers knit him 2 pairs of blue woolen yarn stockings, and hung them for him on Christmas Eve for a Christmas present. There they would hang, 8 pairs of stockings with nothing in them, in a row on the mantel shelf, every Christmas morning. Every year Julia thought about it for weeks before Christmas, and hoped He would have something different this time, but there they always hung, and he had to go and kiss his grandmother's, and pretend he liked the stockings the best of anything he could have had, for he would not have hurt their feelings for the world. His parents might have bettered matters a little, but they did not wish to cross the old ladies either, and they had to buy so much yarn they could not afford to get anything else. The worst of it was, the stockings were knit so well, and of such stout material, that they never wore out. So Julia never really needed the new ones. If he had, that might have reconciled him to the sameness of his Christmas presents, for he was a very sensible boy. But his bureau drawers were full of the blue stockings rolled up in neat little hard balls, all the balls he ever had. The tears used to spring up in his eyes every time he looked at them, but he never said a word till the Christmas when he was 12 years old. Somehow that time he was unusually cast down at the sight of the 8 pairs of stockings hanging in a row under the mantel shelf. But he kissed and thanked his grandmothers just as he always had. When he was out on the street a little later, however, he sat down in a doorway and cried. He could not help it. Some of the other boys had such lovely presents, and he had nothing but these same blue woolen stockings. "What's the matter, little boy?" asked a voice. Without looking up, Julia sobbed out his troubles. But what was his horror when he felt himself seized by the arm and lifted up, and found that he was in the grasp of a policeman in white top boots. The policeman did not mind Julia's tears and entreaties in the least, but led him away to the Patchwork School, waving his stick with its blue ribbon bow as majestically as a drum major. So Julia had to sit down in a little chair and sew patchwork with the rest. He did not mind the close work as much as some of the others, for he was used to being kept indoors, attending to his grandmother's wants. But he disliked to sew. His term of punishment was a long one. The patchwork woman who fixed it thought it looked very badly for a little boy to be complaining because his kind grandparents had given him some warm stockings instead of foolish toys. The first thing the children had to do when they entered the school was to make their patchwork clothes, as I have said. Julia had got his finished and was busily sewing on a red and green patchwork quilt in a tea-chest pattern, when, one day, the mayor came to visit the school. Just then his son did not happen to be serving a term there. The mayor never visited it with visitors of distinction when he was. Today he had a Chinese ambassador with him. The patchwork woman sat behind her desk on the platform and sewed patchwork. The mayor in his fine broadcloth sat one side of her, and the Chinese ambassador in his yellow satin gown on the other. The ambassador's name was To Chum. The children could not help stealing glances occasionally at his high eyebrows and braided queue, but they cast their eyes on their sewing again directly. The mayor and the ambassador stayed about an hour. Then, after they had both made some remarks, the ambassador made his in Chinese. He could speak English, but his remarks in Chinese were wiser. They rose to go. Now, the door of the Patchwork School was of a very peculiar structure. It was made of iron of a great thickness, and opened like any safe door, only it had more magic about it than any safe door ever had. At a certain hour in the afternoon it shut of its own accord, and opened at a certain hour in the morning, when the patchwork woman repeated a formula before it. The formula did no good whatever at any other time. The door was so constructed that not even its inventor could open it after it shut at the certain hour of the afternoon, before the certain hour the next morning. Now the mayor and the Chinese ambassador had stayed rather longer than they should have. They had been so interested in the school that they had not noticed how the time was going, and the patchwork woman had been so taken up with a very intricate new pattern that she failed to remind them, as was her custom. So it happened that while the mayor got through the iron door safely, Just as the Chinese ambassador was following, it suddenly swung to and shut his braided queue at a very high point. Then there was the ambassador on one side of the door, and his queue on the other, and the door could not possibly be opened before morning. Here was a terrible dilemma. What was to be done? There stood the children, their patchwork in their hands, staring open-mouthed at the queue dangling through the door, and the patchwork woman, pale with dismay, in their midst. On one side of the door, and on the other side was the terror-stricken mayor and the poor Chinese ambassador. "Can't anything be done?" shouted the mayor through the keyhole. There was a very large keyhole. "No," the patchwork woman said, "the door won't open till 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Oh, try," groaned the mayor. "Say the formula." She said the formula to satisfy them, but the door stayed firmly shut. Evidently the Chinese ambassador would have to stay where he was until morning, unless he had the mayor snip his queue off, which was not to be thought of. So the mayor, who was something of a philosopher, set about accommodating himself, or rather his friend, to the situation. "It is inevitable," said he to the ambassador. "I am very sorry, but everybody has to conform to the customs of the institutions of the countries which they visit. I will go and get you some dinner, and an extra coat. I will keep you company through the night, and morning will come before you know it." "Well," sighed the Chinese ambassador, standing on tiptoes so his queue should not pull so hard. He was a patient man, but after he had eaten his dinner, the time seemed terrible long. "Why don't you talk?" said he to the mayor, who was dozing beside him in an easy-chair. "Can't you tell me a story?" "I never did such a thing in my life," replied the mayor, rousing himself. "But I am very sorry for you, dear sir. Perhaps the patchwork woman can." So he asked the patchwork woman through the keyhole. "I never told a story in my life," said she, "but there's a boy here that I heard telling a beautiful one the other day. Here, Julia," called she, "come and tell a story to the Chinese ambassador." Julia really knew a great many stories which his grandmothers had taught him, and he sat on a little stool and told them through the keyhole all night to the Chinese ambassador. He and the mayor were so interested that morning came and the door swung open before they knew it. The poor ambassador drew a long breath and put his hand around to his queue to see if it was safe. Then he wanted to thank and reward the boy who had made the long night hours pass so pleasantly. "What is he in here for?" asked the mayor, patting Julia, who could hardly keep his eyes open. "He grumbled about his Christmas presents," replied the patchwork woman. "What did you have?" inquired the mayor. 8 pairs of blue yarn stockings," answered Julia, rubbing his eyes. "And the year before?" 8 pairs of blue yarn stockings. "And the year before that?" 8 pairs of blue yarn stockings. "Didn't you ever have anything for Christmas presents but blue yarn stockings?" asked the astonished mayor. "No, sir," said Julia meekly. Then the whole story came out. Julia, by dint of questioning, told some, and the other children told the rest, and finally, in the afternoon, orders came to dress him in his own clothes and send him home. But when he got there, the mayor and Chinese ambassador had been there before him, and there hung the 8 pairs of blue yarn stockings under the mantel shelf, crammed full of the most beautiful things, knives, balls, candy, everything he had ever wanted, and the mantel shelf piled high also. A great many of the presents were of Chinese manufacture, for the ambassador considered them, of course, superior, and he wished to express his gratitude to Julia as forcibly as he could. There was one stocking entirely filled with curious Chinese tops. A little round head, so much like the ambassador's that it actually startled Julia, peeped out of the stocking. But it was only a top in the shape of a little man in a yellow silk gown, who could spin around very successfully on one foot, for an astonishing length of time. There was a Chinese lady top, too, who fanned herself coquettishly as she spun, and a mandarin who nodded wisely. The tops were enough to turn a boy's head. There were equally curious things in the other stockings. Some of them Julia had no use for, such as silk for dresses, China crape shawls, and fans, but they were just the things for his grandmothers, who, after this, sat beside the fireplace, very prim and fine, in stiff silk gowns, with China crape shawls over their shoulders, and Chinese fans in their hands, and queer shoes on their feet. Julia liked their presents just as well as he did his own, and probably the ambassador knew that he would. The mayor had filled one stocking himself with bonbons, and Julia picked out all the peppermints amongst them for his grandmothers. They were very fond of peppermints. Then he went to work to find their spectacles, which had been lost ever since he had been away. End of The Patchwork School by Mary E. Wilkins.
The Pig and the Sheep by Aesop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pig and the Sheep. A pig found his way into a meadow where a flock of sheep were grazing. The shepherd caught him and was proceeding to carry him off to the butcher's when he set up a loud squealing and struggled to get free. The sheep rebuked him for making such a to-do and said to him, "The shepherd catches us regularly and drags us off just like that, and we don't make any fuzz." "No, I dare say not," replied the pig, "but my case and yours are altogether different. He only wants you for wool, but he wants me for bacon." End of The Pig and the Sheep by Aesop. Read by Darth Vader.
The Prince, Two Mice, and Some Kitchen Maids by Edith Nesbit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. When the Prince was born, the Queen said to the King, "My dear, do be very, very careful about the invitations. You know what fairies are. They always come to the christening whether you invite them or not, and if you forget to invite one of them, she always makes herself so terribly unpleasant." "My love," said the King, "I will invite them all." And he took out his diamond-pointed pen and wrote out the cards on the spot. But just then a herald came in to bring the news of war, so the King had to go off in a hurry. The invitations were sent out, but the christening had to be put off for a year. At the end of this time the King had subdued all his enemies, so he was very pleased with himself. The Prince was a year old, and he also was pleased with himself, as all good babies are, and found the little royal fingers and toes a fresh and ever delightful mystery. And the Queen was pleased with herself, as all good mothers should be, so everything went merrily. The palace was hung with cloth of silver and strewn with fresh daisies in honour of the great day, and after all had eaten and drunk to their heart's content, the fairies came near with the gifts they had brought to their godson, the Prince. "He shall have beauty," said the first. "And wit," said the second. "And a pretty sweetheart," said the third. "Who loves him," said the fourth. And so they went on, foretelling for him all sorts of happy and desirable things. And as each fairy gave her gift, she stooped and kissed the baby Prince, and then spreading her fine gossamer gauze wings, fluttered away across the rosy garden. The crowd of fairies grew less and less, and there were only 3 left, when the Queen pulled the King's sleeve and whispered, "My dear, where's Malevola?" "I sent her a card," said the King, casting an anxious look round him. "Then it must have been lost on the way," said the Queen, "or she'd have been here."
"She is here,"
said a low voice in the Queen's ear. Suddenly the room grew dark, grey clouds hid the sun, and all the daisies on the floor shut up quite close. The poor Queen gave a start and a scream, and the King, brave as he was, turned pale, for Malevola was a terrible fairy, and the dress she wore was not at all the thing for a christening. It was made of spiders' webs matted together, dark and dank with the damp of the tomb and the dust of dungeons. Her wings were the wings of a great bat. Spiders and newts crawled round her neck. A serpent coiled about her waist, and little snakes twisted and writhed in her straight black hair. She looked at the Queen so terribly that her poor Mother Majesty cried out without meaning to. "Oh, don't!" she cried, and flung both arms round the cradle. The Prince was quite happy playing with his new coral and bells, and looking at the palace cat who sat at the foot of the cradle washing herself.
"Now listen," said Malevola, still speaking in the low, even voice that was so terrible. "You did not invite me to the christening. I've read my fairy tales, and I know what's expected of a fairy who is left out on an occasion like this. I intend to curse your son."
Then all the kings and queens who had come to the christening wished they had stayed away, and they and all the court fell on their knees and begged Malevola for mercy. As for the 3 good fairies who were left, they hid behind the window curtains, and the court ladies, peeping between their fingers, said, "Fancy deserting their godson like this! How unfairy-like!" But the Queen and the King only wept, and the Prince played with his rattle and looked at the cat. Then Malevola said mockingly,
"Great king and mighty sovereign, Malevola was not good enough to be asked to your tea-party, but your family shall come down in the world. Your son shall marry a kitchen-maid, and marry a lady with 4 feet and no hands."
A shiver of horror ran through the room, and Malevola vanished. Then suddenly the sun came out, and people lifted up their heads and dared again to look at each other, and the daisies too opened their eyes again. Then the good fairies came out from behind the window curtains, and the poor Queen fell on her knees before them. "Can't you do anything?" she asked. "Can't you undo what she says and make it untrue?" "Not even a fairy can make a true thing untrue," said the good fairies sadly. "Malevola's words will come true, but the Prince has already many gifts, and our gifts are yet to give, and these you shall choose. Whatever you wish shall be his." Then the King, recovering a little from the terror into which the fairy Malevola had thrown him, and remembering how well he and his royal line had always borne them in battle, said at once, "Let the boy be brave." "He is brave," said one of the good fairies. "He fears nothing." And at this the Prince ceased to feel any fear of the palace cat. He put out his hand and pulled her tail so merrily that Pussy turned and clawed his little arm till the blood ran. "Oh dear!" cried his mother. "He is fearless, as you say. I wish he were afraid of cats, poor darling." "He is," said the second fairy. "You have your wish." And indeed the Prince screamed and hid his face, and shrank from the palace cat with such horror that the King pulled out his pencil and notebook, and wrote an edict then and there banishing all cats from his dominions. But all the same he was very angry. "Your Majesty has wasted one wish," he said very politely to the Queen. "Now let us leave the last gift in the hands of the last fairy." The last fairy came and kissed the Prince, who was now sobbing sleepily. "He shall be happy," she said. "He shall have his heart's desire." Then she too vanished, and the kings and queens took their leave when their gold coaches came for them. And presently the King and Queen were left alone with the silver hangings and the strewn daisies and the baby. "Oh dear," said the Queen. "This is dreadful. A kitchen maid, and a lady with 4 feet and no hands." "At least we are not likely to have a kitchen maid with less than 2 hands," said the King. "We might arrange to only have titled kitchen maids," said the Queen timidly. "The very thing," the King answered. "That would make the love affair all that one could wish, but there's still the marriage." "Of course he'll marry the lady he loves." "That's not the way of the world," said the King. "At any rate, let's hope he'll love the lady he marries, otherwise—" "Otherwise what?" said the Queen. "We know nothing about otherwise, do we, my Queen?" he said, catching her round the waist. And in his love for his wife and his son, the King felt almost happy again, for here they were, all 3 together, and when your son is in his cradle, his marriage seems very far off indeed. But the Queen was anxious and frightened, and while the Prince was still a child, she sent messengers to the courts of all the neighbouring kings and queens to tell them what had been foretold, which indeed most of them knew, having been at the christening. and she begged each of them as had daughters to send them as kitchen maids, so that the prince might at least fall in love with a real princess. And as the prince grew up, he was so handsome and so brave, fearing nothing but cats, which of course he never saw, though he dreamed of them often and woke screaming, and also so brilliant and good, that his father's kingdom being beyond compare the finest in all the round world, the young daughters of kings vied with each other as to who should find favour in the eyes of the queen mother, and so get leave to serve in the kitchen, each nursing the hope that some day the prince would see her and love her, and perhaps even marry her. And he was very good friends with all the noble kitchen maids, but he loved none of them, till one day he saw, at a window of the tower where the kitchen was, a bright face and bright hair tied round with a scarlet kerchief. And as he looked at the face it was withdrawn, but the prince had lost his heart. He kept his secret safe in the place where his heart had been, and schemed and plotted to see this fair lady again. For when he went among the royal kitchen maids she was not there with them. And he looked morning, noon, and evening, but he could never see her. So then he said, I must watch of nights. Perhaps she is kept in prison in the tower above the kitchen, and at night those who watch her may sleep, and so I shall be able to talk to her. So he dressed in dark clothes, and hid in the shadow of the palace courtyard, and watched all one night. But he saw nothing. But in the early morning, when the setting moon and the rising sun were mixing their lights in the sky, he heard a heavy bolt shot back, and the door of the kitchen tower opened slowly. The prince crouched behind a buttress and watched, and he saw the fair maid with the bright hair under the red kerchief. She swept the doorstep, and she drew water from the well in the middle of the courtyard. And presently he crept to the kitchen window and saw her light the fire and wash the dishes, and make all neat and clean within. And the prince's eyes followed her in all she did, and the more he looked at her the more he loved her. And at last he heard sounds as of folks stirring above, so he crept away, keeping close to the wall, and so back to his own rooms. And this he did again the next morning, and on the next. And on the third morning, as he stood looking through the window at the girl with the bright hair and the bright kerchief, the gold chain he wore clinked against the stone of the window-sill. The maid started, and the bowl she held dropped onto the brick floor of the kitchen and broke into 20 pieces. And then and there she sat down on the floor beside it and began to cry bitterly. The prince ran in and knelt beside her. "Don't cry, dear," he said. "I'll get you another bowl." "It isn't that," she sobbed, "but now they'll send me away." "Who will?" "The noble kitchen maids. They keep me to do the work because, being king's daughters, they don't know how to do anything. But the queen doesn't know that there is a real kitchen maid here, and now you have found out they will send me away." And she went on crying. "Then you are a real kitchen maid, and not noble at all?" said the prince. She stopped crying for a minute to say, "No." "Never mind," said the prince. "You are twice as pretty as all the king's daughters put together, and 20 times as dear." At that she stopped crying for good and all, and looked up at him from the floor where she sat. "Yes, you are," he said, "and I love you with all my heart." And with that he caught her in his arms and kissed her. And the real kitchen maid laid her face against his, and her heart beat wildly, for she knew what the prince did not, and what, indeed, all the folk knew except the prince, that this had been foretold at his christening. But she knew also that though he loved her, he was not to marry her, since it was his dreadful destiny to marry someone with 4 feet and no hands. "I wish I had no hands and 4 feet," said the real kitchen maid to herself. "I wouldn't mind a bit, since it is me he loves." "What are you saying?" asked the prince. "I am saying that you must go," said she. "If their kitchen highnesses find you here with me, they'll tear me into little pieces, for they all love you." To a highness. "And you," he whispered, "how much do you love me?" "Oh," she answered, "I love you better than my right hand and my left." And the prince thought that a very strange answer. He went through that day in a happy dream, but he did not tell his dream to anyone, lest some harm should come to the real kitchen maid, for he meant to marry her, and he had a feeling that his parents would not approve of the match. Now that night, when the whole palace was asleep, the real kitchen maid got up and crept out past the sleepy sentinel and went home to her father the farmer, and got one of his great white cart-horses, and rode away through the woods to the cavern where the great white rat sits sleeplessly guarding the magic cat's eye. And everyone wondered why he guarded it so carefully, for it seemed to have no great value. But the great white rat watched it constantly, without ever closing one of those round bright rat eyes of his, and when folk sought to lay hands on it, he said, "Be careful, it has the power to change you into a mouse," on which folk dropped it hastily and went their ways, leaving him still on guard. To him now went the little kitchen maid and asked for help, for he was thousands of years old, and had more wisdom between his nose and ears than all the books in all the world. She told him all that had happened. "Now what shall I do?" she said. And the great white rat, never shifting his eyes from the magic cat's eye, answered, "Keep your own counsel and be contented. The prince loves you." "But," said the real kitchen maid, "he is not to marry me, but a horrible creature with 4 feet and no hands." "Keep your secret and be content," the great white rat repeated, "and if you ever see him in danger from a lady with 4 feet and no hands, come straight to me." So the real kitchen maid went back to the palace, and set to work to clean pots and pans, for now it was bright dewy daylight, and the night had gone. And before the rest were awake again, her prince came to her and vowed he loved her more than life, so she kept her secret and was content. At the time of the prince's christening, the king had banished all cats from the kingdom, because he could not bear to see his son show fear of anything. But now and then strangers, not knowing of the edict, brought cats to that country, and if the prince saw one of these cats, he was taken with a trembling and a paleness, standing like stone awhile, and presently, with shrieks of terror, fleeing the spot. And it was now a long time since he had seen a cat. Now, soon after the prince had found out how he loved the real kitchen maid, his father and mother died suddenly, as they were sitting hand in hand, for they loved each other so much that it was not possible for either to stay here without the other. So then the prince wept bitterly and would not be comforted, and the court stood about him with a long face, wearing its new mourning. And as he sat there with his face hidden, something came through the palace gate, and up the marble steps, and into the great hall where the prince sat on the steps of his father's throne, weeping. And before the courtiers could draw breath or decide whether it was court etiquette for them to do anything while the prince was crying, except to stand still and look sad, the creature came up to the prince and began to rub itself against his arm, and he, still hiding his face, reached out his hand and stroked it. Then all the court drew a deep breath, for they saw that the thing that had come in was a great black cat. And the prince raised his eyes, and they looked to see him shrink and shriek, but instead he passed his hand over the black fur and said, "Poor pussy, then." And at these words the whole court fled, by window and door. The courtiers took horse, those who had carriages went away with them, those who had none went on foot, and in less than a minute the prince and the cat were left alone together. For the court was learned in witch lore, and knowing the prince's horror of cats, it saw at once that a cat he was not afraid of was no cat at all, but a witch in that shape. Therefore the courtiers and the whole royal household fled trembling and hid themselves. All but the little real kitchen maid. She saw with terror that the cat, or rather the witch in cat shape, had done what no one else could do, roused the prince from his dull dream of grief. And then she remembered the fate which Malevola had foretold for him, that he should marry a lady with 4 feet and no hands. "Alack-a-day!" she cried, "this witch has 4 feet and no hands, but she can have hands whenever she chooses, and be a woman by her magic arts as easily as she can be a cat, and then he will love her, and what will become of me? Or worse, she may marry him only to torment him. She may shut him up in some enchanted dungeon far from the light of day. Such things have happened before now." So she stood, hidden by the blue arras, and wrung her hands, and the tears ran down her cheeks. And all the time the black cat purred to the prince, and the prince stroked the black cat, and anyone could have seen that he was every moment becoming more deeply bewitched. And still the real kitchen maid crouched behind the arras, and her heart ached that it knew no way to save him. Then suddenly she remembered the words of the great white rat. "If you ever see him in danger from a lady with 4 feet and no hands, come straight to me." Now surely was the time, for the prince, she knew, was in desperate danger. The real kitchen maid crept silently down the marble stairs, but once she was out of the palace she ran like the wind to the stable. No men were about there. All had followed the example of the court, and had run away when they heard of the strange coming of the witch-cat. And of all the many horses that had stood in the stable, only one remained, for each man in his fright had saddled the first horse that came to hand, and ridden off on it. and the one that still stayed there was the prince's own black charger. He had had no mind to be saddled in haste by a stranger, and had turned and bitten the stranger who had attempted it, so he was there alone. Now the little kitchen maid lifted the prince's gold-broidered saddle from its perch, and the weight of it was such that she could not have carried it but for the heavy heart she bore because of her love to the prince and his danger, and that made all else seem light. She put the saddle on the charger and the jewelled bridle, and he neighed with pleasure, for he understood, being a horse who could see as far into a stone wall as most people. And when he was saddled he knelt for her to mount, and then up and away like the wind, and she had no need to guide him with the reins, for he found the way and kept it. He galloped steadily on, and when the sun went down and the night grew dark, he went on and on and on without stumble or pause, till at moonrise he halted before the house of the Great White Rat. Then, as the real kitchen maid sprang down, the Great White Rat came out from his house and spoke. "You've come for it, then?" "For what?" "The magic cat's eye. I've guarded it some thousands of years. I knew there would be a use for it at last. He may be saved yet, if someone should love him well enough to die for him." "I do that," said the little kitchen maid, and took the cat's eye into her hands. "Swallow it," said the White Rat, "and you'll turn into a mouse." The little maid swallowed it all at once, and behold, she was a little mouse. "What am I to do?" she asked. "I can't tell you," said the Great White Rat, "but love will tell you." So the little kitchen maid in the form of a mouse ran up one of the horse's legs and held tight onto the saddle with all her little claws. And as the great horse galloped back towards the palace in the moonlight, she thought and thought, and at last she said to herself, "The witch is in cat shape, and she must have cat nature, so she will run after a mouse. She will run after me, and if I can lead her to a running stream she will leap across it, and then she will have to take her own shape again. That must be what the Great White Rat meant me to do, and if the cat catches me, well, at least if I can't save my prince I can die for him." And the thought warmed her heart as the great horse thundered on through the dawn light. When at last, creeping softly on little noiseless feet, the mouse kitchen maid re-entered the great hall, she saw that she was only just in time, for the black cat was purring and looking back at the prince as she walked, waving her black tail towards the further door of the hall, and the prince, more bewitched than ever, was slowly following her. Then the real kitchen maid mouse uttered a squeak and rushed across the porphyry floor, and the black cat, true to its cat nature, left purring at the prince and sprang after the mouse. And the mouse at its best speed made for the garden where ran the stream that fed the marble basins where the royal goldfish lived. The prince understood nothing, save that the enchanting black furry creature was leaving him, and in an instant he was alone. He followed to the door, and saw the cat springing along the passage down the stairs. He followed fast, then along another passage that passed the foot of the back stairs, and then he saw that the back stairs were like a waterfall. Water was running down in a torrent, and meandering away down the brick passage and out into the faint new sunshine. When the mouse saw this stream, she thought, "I'm saved." She never thought of wondering how a stream came to be running down the back stairs of the palace. When she came to think of it afterwards, she always believed that the Great White Rat had managed it somehow. She never knew that it was really a great flood from the royal bathroom, where the royal housemaid, in her eagerness to run away from the witch, had left all the royal bath taps full on. The mouse bounded across the stream. The cat saw the danger, but she could not stop herself. She too crossed the stream, and as she crossed it, she turned into the wicked fairy Malevola, cobwebs and snakes and newts and bat-wings and all. The prince put his hand to his head like one awakening from sleep, and the horrible fairy vanished suddenly and for ever. Then the mouse ran trembling to the prince, and in its thin little mouse's voice told him all. "My love and my lady," he said, holding the mouse against his cheek, "I will marry you now. That will carry out the wicked fairy's prophecy. Then we will go back to the Great White Rat, and you shall be changed into a princess." So the prince rang the church bells till all the people came out of their holes where they had been hiding to see the strange spectacle of a prince married to a mouse. And directly they were married, they set off on the black charger, and when they reached the Great White Rat they told their tale. "And now," said the prince joyously, "if you will change her into a lady again, we will go home at once and begin living happily ever after." The Great White Rat looked at them gravely. "It's impossible," he said. I'm sorry, but the effects of the magic cat's eye are permanent. Once a mouse, always a mouse, if you get moused by the magic cat's eye. The prince and the mouse looked sadly at each other. This was the last thing they had expected. The great white rat looked at them earnestly. Then he said, "If it would be any use to you, I've got another magic cat's eye." He held it out. The prince took it gladly. Kingdom and the life of a king were nothing to him compared with the love and happiness of a real kitchen-maid disguised as a mouse. He put the stone to his lips. "You know what'll happen if you do," said the great white rat. "I shall change into a mouse and live happily ever after," said the prince gaily. "Perhaps," said the great white rat. "Nothing is impossible if people love each other enough." "You mustn't!" cried the mouse, trying to get between his lips and the cat's eye. "My dear little real kitchen maid," said the prince tenderly, "you have saved my life, and you are my life. I would rather be a mouse with you than a king without you." And with that he swallowed the cat's eye, and 2 small mice stood side by side before the great white rat. Very kindly he looked at them. Then he pulled a hair from his left whisker and laid it across their little brown backs. And on the instant there stood up a prince and a princess, and at their feet lay the little empty mouse skins. "It's lucky for you," said the great white rat, "that you chose to swallow the cat's eye, because people who have been moused by that means can never be unmoused except in pairs. Nothing is impossible if people only love each other enough." So the prince and his bride returned to the palace and lived happily ever after. They were as happy as if they had been mice, which, in a country where there are no cats, is saying a good deal. Of course, the prince is still afraid of cats, but the curious thing is that now his wife is afraid of them too. Perhaps she learnt that lesson when she was a mouse for his sake. He, when he was a mouse for hers, learned this lesson, which is also the moral of this story. Nothing is impossible if people only love each other enough. End of The Prince, 2 Mice and Some Kitchen Maids by Edith Nesbit. Read by Beth Thomas.